Think you know Cleopatra? Hollywood and popular culture have lied to you for decades. Get ready to have everything you thought you knew about history's most famous queen completely turned upside down. For generations, we've been fed a version of her story that's more fiction than fact, a tale woven from Roman propaganda, Shakespearean drama, and silver screen fantasies. But what if I told you that the real Cleopatra was nothing like the exotic seductress you've seen in movies? What if nearly every single detail you think you know about her is wrong? We're about to embark on a journey through time to uncover the truth behind one of history's most misunderstood figures. This isn't just another history lesson. It's a myth-busting expedition that will challenge everything you thought you understood about ancient Egypt's final pharaoh. From her surprising ethnic background to the reality of her legendary beauty, from the truth about her dramatic death to her incredible political strategies that kept her in power for decades, we're going to shatter 35 of the biggest misconceptions that have clouded her true story for centuries. Imagine discovering that the woman you thought was just a beautiful temptress was actually one of the most brilliant political minds of her era, a polyglot who spoke 9 languages, a naval commander who personally led her fleets into battle, and a ruler whose intelligence and diplomatic skills made Julius Caesar and Mark Antony respect her as an equal. This exploration isn't just about setting the historical record straight. It's about reclaiming the legacy of a woman whose true story is far more fascinating than any Hollywood fiction. So prepare to see Cleopatra in a whole new light as we separate fact from fiction and reveal the astonishing reality behind history's most iconic queen. Let's start with the most fundamental misconception of all, the very first thing you've got wrong about Cleopatra. If I asked you to picture her, you'd likely imagine a woman with dark, kohl-rimmed eyes, perhaps adorned in traditional Egyptian headdresses and jewelry, the very embodiment of ancient Egypt. But the truth is, Cleopatra was not Egyptian, not even close. She was in fact Greek. Her family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years by the time she was born, but they were foreign conquerors, not native Egyptians. It all began with Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. After Alexander's empire was divided, Ptolemy took control of Egypt. He and his descendants, including Cleopatra, were Macedonians through and through. They saw themselves as a Greek ruling class presiding over a land of Egyptian subjects. To maintain their pure bloodline and their distinct identity, the Ptolemies were notorious for intermarrying within their own family. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, in a complex web of dynastic unions designed to keep power concentrated and their Hellenistic heritage undiluted. This makes Cleopatra's family tree less of a tree and more of a tangled wreath. She was the product of generations of this practice. The cultural divide was stark within her own palace. The Ptolemies primarily spoke Greek and conducted all their official business in Greek. They worshipped Greek gods, though they often cleverly merged them with Egyptian deities for political purposes. If you look at the coinage minted during her reign, you don't see the stylized art of ancient Egypt. You see a very clear, very Hellenistic portrait of a ruler with a strong jawline, a prominent nose, and a sharp chin, features consistent with her Macedonian ancestry, a far cry from the exotic Hollywood image. Statues from the period further confirm this, depicting her with the classic features of Greek sculpture rather than traditional Egyptian artistic conventions. So the woman who became the living symbol of Egypt was ethnically and culturally its last Greek queen. This brings us directly to the second, and perhaps most hotly debated, misconception you've got wrong about Cleopatra. In recent years, a powerful and emotionally charged narrative has emerged, suggesting she was a black African queen. While this idea speaks to a deep and understandable desire for representation and cultural reclamation, the historical evidence simply doesn't support it. The Ptolemaic dynasty was famously, almost obsessively, insular. They practiced royal incest not out of affection, but as a calculated political strategy to maintain their pure Macedonian Greek bloodline and prevent power from leaking to the native Egyptian aristocracy. Cleopatra's own parents were siblings, a common practice in her family. Her family tree, which historians have meticulously pieced together from ancient records, shows a consistent line of Greek ancestors stretching back to Ptolemy I, with no documented intermarriage with Egyptians or peoples from sub-Saharan Africa for nearly 300 years. This isn't to say she existed in a vacuum. She was undoubtedly a product of her environment in Alexandria, a vibrant, cosmopolitan melting pot, but her identity was firmly rooted in her Hellenistic heritage. She was the first ruler in her dynasty to even bother learning the Egyptian language, which tells us that her predecessors saw no need to connect with the culture of the people they ruled. This fact alone highlights the vast cultural chasm between the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic elite and the native Egyptian population. So why does this misconception hold such powerful sway today? It's a beautiful and compelling act of reclamation. For many, placing a figure of Cleopatra's immense power, intelligence, and influence within the framework of Black history is a way to counteract centuries of Eurocentric narratives that have often marginalized or erased African contributions to the ancient world. It's a desire to see a reflection of themselves in one of history's most iconic women. However, understanding her true Macedonian background is actually far more fascinating and speaks volumes about her genius. Cleopatra was a foreigner, a descendant of conquerors ruling a land that was not her ancestral home. Her incredible achievement was mastering the art of political theater to bridge that gap. She didn't just adopt Egyptian customs and religion for show, she weaponized them. By presenting herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, she seamlessly merged her Greek identity with the soul of Egypt, forging a powerful unity that allowed her to hold onto her throne against insurmountable odds. Appreciating this calculated, brilliant synthesis is far more revealing than assigning her an identity she never claimed. Her power didn't come from her ethnicity, but from her unparalleled ability to transcend it. This obsession with her supposed beauty leads us directly into the third massive misconception, the one that has perhaps defined her popular image more than any other. We have all been sold the idea that Cleopatra's power stemmed from an almost supernatural physical beauty, that she was so stunningly gorgeous she could effortlessly ensnare the most powerful men in the world. But what if the ancient sources tell a completely different story? The most telling account comes from the Greek biographer Plutarch, who lived about a century after Cleopatra and had access to sources that are now lost. He makes a point that is absolutely crucial to understanding her true nature. He writes, "Her beauty was not in itself so remarkable, but the contact of her presence was irresistible." He goes on to explain that the real allure was her intelligence, the charm of her conversation, and the persuasive power of her voice. He describes her voice as an instrument of exquisite sweetness, a captivating force that, combined with her brilliant mind and charismatic personality, made her utterly irresistible. Her power wasn't a product of cosmetics and jewelry. It was the power of a first-rate intellect, a sharp wit, and formidable rhetorical skills. So why did the beauty myth take such a firm hold? The answer lies in a powerful and ancient smear campaign. After her defeat, the victorious Romans, particularly Augustus Caesar, needed to justify their war against a woman and dismantle her legacy. They couldn't very well admit that Rome had been outmaneuvered and captivated by a superior political strategist and a charismatic intellectual. That would have been humiliating. Instead, they launched a propaganda war, recasting Cleopatra not as a brilliant leader, but as a dangerous, exotic seductress. They painted her as a debauched Oriental queen who used dark sexual magic to corrupt good Roman men like Julius Caesar and especially Mark Antony. By reducing her to her body, they stripped her of her political and intellectual accomplishments, turning her into a simple villainess, a narrative that was far easier to sell to the Roman public. This Roman caricature was then eagerly adopted and amplified centuries later by Hollywood. The 1963 film starring Elizabeth Taylor cemented the modern image of Cleopatra as a violet-eyed, glamorous siren draped in silks and heavy eye makeup. This glamorized version was pure fantasy, designed for box office appeal, but it became the definitive portrait for an entire generation. The real Cleopatra, as depicted on coins minted during her own reign, shows a woman with a strong, prominent nose, a sharp chin, and deep-set eyes, features considered signs of a powerful ruler and strong character in the Hellenistic world, but not necessarily conforming to modern or even ancient standards of delicate beauty. These realistic portraits, meant for official business, present a sovereign of sharp intellect and determination, not a silver screen goddess. The disconnect between the real woman and the fictionalized icon has never been wider, and it's this fabricated image of unparalleled beauty that we must finally let go of to truly appreciate her genuine and far more impressive genius. And this calculated brilliance brings us to the fourth colossal misconception, the very heart of the Hollywood fantasy, that Cleopatra seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony with nothing more than her physical charms. The truth is far more compelling. She didn't just offer romance, she presented a complete strategic partnership, a package deal that included the vast wealth of Egypt, its powerful naval fleet, and the legitimacy that came with her throne. These men were not lovesick fools, they were the most ambitious political operators of their age, and they saw in Cleopatra a peerless ally who could deliver everything they needed to achieve their monumental goals. Her first encounter with Julius Caesar is the perfect example of this political genius, though it's often misrepresented as a seductive stunt. When she was just 21 years old, her brother husband Ptolemy XIII had driven her out of Alexandria and seized power. Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing his rival Pompey and found himself in the middle of a vicious dynastic dispute. Cleopatra was blockaded in the palace, cut off from any chance to plead her case. Her solution was not to send a flirtatious note, but to orchestrate a breathtakingly audacious covert operation. According to the historian Plutarch, she had herself rolled up inside a sack used for storing bed linens, later romanticized as a carpet, and was smuggled past her brother's guards directly into Caesar's private quarters. This wasn't a theatrical performance designed to entice. It was a desperate, incredibly risky gambit by a deposed monarch fighting for her life and her crown. Imagine the scene not through the lens of romance but of high-stakes politics. A young woman, utterly vulnerable, unfurling herself at the feet of the most powerful man in the Roman world. She arrived not with a sultry gaze but with a persuasive legal argument, presenting herself as the legitimate ruler wronged by her treacherous brother. She was there to negotiate a treaty, not to begin a torrid affair. Her boldness and intelligence won Caesar's respect first. Any romantic involvement came later, cemented by the immense strategic value she represented. This pattern of strategic alliance repeated itself with Mark Antony years later. When Antony summoned the rulers of the East to confront him, he was preparing for a massive campaign against the Parthian Empire. He needed two things above all else: enormous amounts of money to fund his legions and a secure supply line from a loyal ally. Cleopatra arrived on a magnificent golden barge, not merely to dazzle him with a display of wealth, but to deliver a professional sales pitch. She came as a head of state, offering to bankroll his entire war effort in exchange for his support in securing her own throne against her rivals. She was the only ruler in the Mediterranean who could single-handedly underwrite his ambitions. Their relationship was from its foundation a military and financial merger. Antony gained the resources to pursue his dream of an Eastern empire, and Cleopatra gained a powerful Roman protector who could help her restore the Ptolemaic kingdom to its former glory and safeguard the independence of Egypt against the rising threat of Octavian. To reduce these complex, high-stakes partnerships to mere tales of seduction is to ignore the hard political and economic realities of power. Caesar and Antony were seasoned generals and politicians. They didn't risk their reputations and their lives for a pretty face. They did it for control of the grain-rich Nile Valley, for the legendary treasury of the Ptolemies, and for the loyalty of a queen who was every bit their equal in intelligence, ambition, and sheer political will. The romances were likely genuine, but they were the byproduct of mutual ambition and respect, not the cause of the alliance. Cleopatra's greatest weapon was never her beauty. It was her unmatched ability to offer the most powerful men in the world exactly what they needed to fulfill their destiny, and in doing so secure her own. This carefully crafted legend of her death leads us directly into the fifth monumental misconception that has been polished to a fine sheen by centuries of retelling. Everyone knows the story. Trapped by Octavian and choosing death over humiliation, Cleopatra clasped a deadly Egyptian cobra, an asp, to her breast and died from its venomous bite. It's a dramatic, poetic, and visually stunning end fit for a queen. But when you examine the historical sources and the practical realities, this story begins to unravel, revealing a far more complex and uncertain truth. Our main source for her final hours is once again the biographer Plutarch, who wrote about the event roughly a century later, and crucially, Plutarch doesn't present a single definitive account. He offers several different versions that were circulating at the time, showing that even in antiquity, the exact method of her suicide was a matter of speculation and debate. One version holds that she applied a poisonous ointment, another suggests she carried the poison in a hollow hairpin, and yes, a third points to the bite of an asp hidden in a basket of figs. Plutarch himself seems uncertain, writing that the truth of her death was unknown. The simplistic aspirin bite narrative is a later consolidation of these stories, one that favored the most symbolic and dramatic option. And symbolism is precisely why the asp story endured. The Egyptian cobra, or urius, was not just any snake. It was a potent religious and political symbol, worn on the crown of the pharaohs as a representation of divine royalty and protection. By choosing this method, if she did, Cleopatra was making a final, powerful statement. She was identifying herself with the goddess Isis, for whom the serpent was a sacred creature, and asserting her rightful place as the true divine ruler of Egypt until her very last breath. It was the ultimate piece of political theater, a carefully staged exit designed to control her legacy and deny Octavian the satisfaction of parading her in chains through the streets of Rome. Her death was a calculated act of propaganda, and the image of the noble serpent was a far more compelling headline than a simple vial of poison. But when we move from symbolism to cold, hard logistics, the aspirin bite story becomes almost impossible to believe. After Mark Antony's death, Cleopatra was being held under close guard by Octavian's men inside her own mausoleum. Octavian was acutely aware that her alive was a problem, but her dead as a martyr was also a problem. His ideal scenario was capturing her alive to display her in his triumph. His guards would have been under strict orders to prevent exactly this outcome. Smuggling a basket of figs past them is one thing. Smuggling a full-grown, highly agitated Egyptian cobra, large enough to deliver a fatal bite to two women, for her servant Eras is said to have died with her strange credulity. A cobra of that size is not easily concealed, and its behavior is unpredictable. Furthermore, cobra venom is a neurotoxin. Its effects are not always instantaneous, and death can be accompanied by convulsions and respiratory paralysis, a far cry from the serene, peaceful sleep often described. All of these practical hurdles make a concealed poison, perhaps a potent cocktail of toxins like hemlock and opium, the most plausible scenario. Such a mixture would have been easy to hide in a hairpin or a small vial, could have been administered quickly and discreetly, and would have produced a much more tranquil and controlled death, aligning with the peaceful accounts of her passing. The enduring power of the aspirin myth isn't about historical accuracy. It's about the allure of a perfect ending. It provides a clean, symbolic, and visually unforgettable conclusion to the life of a woman who understood the power of her own image better than anyone. The truth is likely more mundane, but in a way far more revealing. Her final act was not one of theatrical impulse, but the last, meticulously planned move of a master strategist, ensuring she exited the world stage on her own terms, leaving behind a legend that we are still trying to unravel 2,000 years later. Now, if her strategic political mind was her greatest asset, then her incredible linguistic ability was the master key that unlocked its full potential. Here's the sixth colossal thing everyone gets wrong: the belief that Cleopatra was a monolingual Egyptian speaker, perhaps needing translators to converse with her Roman allies. Nothing could be further from the truth. While it's absolutely correct and significant that she learned the Egyptian language, becoming the first and only ruler in her 300-year dynasty to bother doing so, that was just one entry in her vast linguistic portfolio. Historical accounts, including those from Plutarch, are explicit. Cleopatra was a hyper-polyglot, fluent in at least 9 languages. Let's break that down. Her native tongue was, of course, Greek, the language of her ancestors and the primary language of administration and culture in her court. But her repertoire extended far beyond that. She was fluent in Latin, the language of Rome, which gave her the extraordinary ability to converse directly with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony without the filter of an intermediary. This wasn't just about convenience, it was a profound psychological and political advantage. Imagine the impact of a foreign ruler addressing the Roman Senate in their own tongue, or negotiating complex treaties without any risk of a translator's error or manipulation. She could charm, persuade, and debate on her own terms in real time. Her linguistic talents stretched across the entire known world. She spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Syriac, the languages of the Levant and Mesopotamia, crucial for diplomacy and trade with the powerful kingdoms to her east. Perhaps most impressively, she was also fluent in the languages of potential enemies, Median and Parthian. The Parthian Empire was the superpower rival of Rome, a constant threat on the eastern frontier. For Cleopatra to understand and speak their language meant she could receive their emissaries, understand their intentions, and potentially even gather intelligence firsthand. It made her an invaluable asset to Rome, not just as a funder of wars, but as a source of critical, on-the-ground knowledge. Even the obscure language of the troglodytes, a people living in caves along the Red Sea coast, was within her grasp, likely to secure trade routes and alliances with desert tribes. This wasn't merely a parlor trick or a sign of a well-educated aristocrat. In the ancient world, where translation was an imprecise art and diplomatic messages could easily be distorted, a ruler's ability to communicate directly was a form of immense soft power. It allowed for nuance, for building genuine rapport, and for projecting an image of almost supernatural competence and intelligence. When an ambassador from, say, Judea or Parthia arrived in her court expecting to speak through a Greek translator, only to be greeted by the queen herself in their own native tongue and dialect, the psychological effect would have been staggering. It immediately placed her in a position of authority and respect, demonstrating that she was a truly global player who had taken the time to understand their world. Her voice, which Plutarch described as so uniquely persuasive, was made infinitely more powerful by the many languages it could command. This linguistic mastery wasn't a footnote in her story. It was a central pillar of her diplomatic strategy, allowing her to hold her own and often dominate in a man's world of power politics. This persistent image of a woman who only achieved power through her romantic entanglements brings us to the seventh and perhaps most insulting misconception of all: the idea that Cleopatra was a weak ruler who relied entirely on men to maintain her throne. This couldn't be further from the truth. To see her as a pawn in the games of Caesar and Antony is to completely misunderstand her life's work. She was from the very beginning a shrewd, calculating, and fiercely independent monarch who viewed her relationships with Roman leaders not as romantic dependencies, but as strategic alliances designed for one overarching purpose: to protect the sovereignty and wealth of Egypt from the insatiable appetite of the expanding Roman Empire. Her political acumen was on display from the moment she took the throne at just 18 years old. She didn't initially rule alone. She was forced into a co-regency with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as per Egyptian tradition and her father's will. But this was a formality she had no intention of honoring. Ancient inscriptions and papyri from the early years of their reign tell a revealing story. Cleopatra's name was consistently listed first, and official documents were issued under her authority alone. She was clearly maneuvering to sideline her brother and establish herself as the sole legitimate power. It was only when a cabal of powerful court advisors, who believed they could control a young boy more easily than a strong-willed young woman, pushed Ptolemy XIII to revolt, that she was temporarily driven from power. Her subsequent return with Caesar wasn't the act of a damsel in distress being rescued. It was a deposed head of state using every tool at her disposal, including a shrewd alliance with a foreign power, to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Once firmly in control, she proved to be a highly effective administrator and economist. One of her greatest and often overlooked achievements was her masterful management of Egypt's economy during a devastating famine that gripped the eastern Mediterranean. While other kingdoms faced starvation and unrest, Cleopatra took decisive action. She opened the royal granaries, the vast storehouses filled with Egypt's surplus grain, but she didn't just give it away. She sold it at a carefully managed price. This brilliant move accomplished three things at once. It prevented mass starvation within her own kingdom, it generated enormous revenue for the royal treasury, and it solidified her image as a benevolent provider for her people. She even went a step further, cornering the regional market by buying up all available grain from other sources to control supply and prices, demonstrating a level of economic savvy that would be impressive in any era. Furthermore, to suggest she was a passive observer in military affairs is to ignore the historical record entirely. Cleopatra was not just a financier of wars, she was a naval commander. During the decisive naval battle of Actium, she was not a spectator on a ship safely behind the lines. She was the commander of her own Egyptian squadron, 60 warships strong, and she was personally leading them. While the battle ultimately ended in defeat due to the strategic failures of Mark Antony, her presence at the head of her fleet is a testament to her active, hands-on role as a military leader. This was not a woman who needed a man to fight for her. She was willing and able to lead her forces into the fray to defend her kingdom's interests. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were the ultimate expression of this geopolitical strategy. She didn't rely on them, she partnered with them. In Caesar, she saw the perfect counterweight to her brother's faction and a powerful voice for her legitimacy in Rome. In Antony, she found a military leader who could help her realize her own vision of a restored Ptolemaic empire, one that could stand as an equal to Rome rather than be consumed by it. She provided the incredible wealth of Egypt and its powerful navy. They provided the military might and political influence of Rome. It was a transactional partnership between equals, each providing what the other lacked. To frame this as reliance is to apply a modern, sexist lens to ancient power politics. Cleopatra was playing the same game as every other Hellenistic ruler, forging alliances, securing borders, and expanding influence. She was just far more successful at it than most, and she did it all while navigating the immense challenge of being a woman in a world dominated by men. Her goal was never to become a Roman consort. It was to ensure that Egypt, under her rule, remained independent, powerful, and eternal. This brings us to the eighth and perhaps most pervasive misconception of all. the image of Cleopatra as a nymphomaniac seductress, a woman driven by insatiable sexual appetites who hopped from one lover's bed to another. This salacious caricature is one of history's most successful and enduring pieces of character assassination, and its origins are not found in the sands of Egypt, but in the political smear campaigns of ancient Rome. The creation of this myth was a deliberate and calculated act of propaganda by the victorious Octavian, who later became the Emperor Augustus. After defeating Cleopatra and Antony at the Battle of Actium, Octavian faced a significant public relations problem. He had just waged a brutal civil war against a fellow Roman, Mark Antony. But to justify this conflict to the Roman people, he couldn't frame it as Roman against Roman. That would have been unpopular and divisive. Instead, he had to portray it as a noble, patriotic war against a foreign menace. The problem was that foreign menace was a woman. In the deeply patriarchal Roman world, being defeated by a woman in battle was the ultimate humiliation. The solution was ingenious and vicious. Instead of portraying Cleopatra as a formidable political and military equal, Octavian's propagandists recast her as a monstrous, unnatural force. They painted her not as a strategist but as a sorceress of sex. Roman poets like Horace and Virgil were enlisted to craft this new narrative. They described her not as a queen but as a fatale monstrum, a fatal monster. She became the embodiment of decadent Eastern luxury, a threat to the sober, virtuous, and masculine values of Rome. In their poetry, she didn't outthink or outmaneuver Antony, she enslaved him with her wicked charms. She was depicted as a drunken, promiscuous deviant who corrupted a once great Roman general, weakening his mind and his morals until he was no longer fit to lead. This narrative served multiple purposes. It absolved Antony of some blame by making him a victim of magic and seduction. It justified the war as a defense of Roman morality, and it completely erased Cleopatra's very real political and intellectual accomplishments. Her power had to be explained as supernatural and sexual because the alternative, that she was simply smarter and more capable, was too threatening to the Roman ego. When we look at the actual historical record, this portrait completely falls apart. The evidence points to a woman who was, by the standards of any royal court, remarkably restrained in her personal life. We have detailed accounts of only 2 romantic partners in her entire life, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. To put this in perspective, consider the behavior of her contemporaries. Her own father, Ptolemy XII, was nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, for his frivolous and party-loving nature. Many Roman senators and generals were notorious for their numerous affairs, scandals, and debaucheries. In this context, Cleopatra's 2 documented relationships look less like the record of a sex-crazed man-eater and more like the calculated alliances of a head of state. These were not frivolous flings, they were the geopolitical equivalent of corporate mergers. Each relationship lasted for years and was defined by mutual political and military ambition. With Caesar, she secured her throne, bore a son and heir to solidify her dynasty's future, and gained a powerful protector in Roman politics. With Antony, she orchestrated a grand strategy to create a new Hellenistic Roman Eastern Empire that could counter the rising power of Octavian and safeguard Egypt's independence for generations. She didn't choose these men for their looks or their charm. She chose them for their power and their utility to her primary goal, the preservation of her kingdom. In a world where royal women were often used as bargaining chips in political marriages, Cleopatra flipped the script entirely. She was the one doing the bargaining. She selected her partners, negotiated the terms of their alliances, and used the relationships to amass greater power and security for her nation. The real story isn't one of reckless seduction. It's one of cold, calculated strategy using the tools available to her in a world dominated by male power. The Roman myth of the sex-crazed temptress says far more about their own insecurities and prejudices than it does about the real woman who ruled Egypt. This notion of a queen lost in sensual pleasure brings us to the ninth grand misconception, one that paints a vivid and misleading picture of her royal court. Popular imagination, fueled by Roman propaganda and decades of Hollywood excess, envisions Cleopatra's palace in Alexandria as a den of unimaginable decadence, a place of endless feasts, drunken orgies, and reckless indulgence. While the Ptolemaic court was indeed legendary for its almost unimaginable wealth, to reduce it to a non-stop party is to completely miss what made it one of the most dazzling intellectual and cultural centers the ancient world had ever seen. The real palace complex was not a temple of debauchery. It was the nerve center of a powerful government, a global hub for trade and diplomacy, and most importantly, the home of the greatest university and library in human history. At the heart of this intellectual empire was the legendary Library of Alexandria and its attached research institute, the Museum or Temple of the Muses. This wasn't just a storage place for scrolls, it was the ancient equivalent of NASA, Oxford University, and the Royal Society all rolled into one. The Ptolemies had a voracious appetite for knowledge, and they funded a permanent community of the world's greatest minds. The library's ambitious goal was to collect a copy of every known book in the world. Scholars were paid handsome salaries to live there, conduct research, debate, write, and teach. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, this institution produced staggering advancements. It was here that the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos first proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, placing the sun at the center nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus. The geographer and mathematician Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy by measuring the angles of shadows in two different cities. Physicians like Herophilus conducted groundbreaking anatomical studies, even practicing human dissection. This was the environment Cleopatra was born into and presided over. She wasn't just a passive benefactor, she was an active participant and a product of this intense scholarly culture. As a highly educated monarch, she was undoubtedly well versed in the discussions happening right outside her palace doors. Her court would have been filled with the leading philosophers, poets, engineers, and doctors of the age. Imagine the conversations, debates on ethics and governance with Stoic and Epicurean thinkers, discussions on new geometric theorems with mathematicians, or consultations with physicians about new medical treatments. This was a queen who could discuss the intricacies of celestial navigation with her admirals and the nuances of tax policy with her treasurers. The idea that her primary entertainment was lounging on a divan while being fed grapes is a profound insult to the vibrant, buzzing, intellectually charged atmosphere she cultivated and thrived in. This is not to say there was no opulence. The palace quarter of Alexandria was famous for its breathtaking beauty, with magnificent buildings, lush gardens, and shaded colonnades stretching along the Mediterranean coastline. Grand receptions and state banquets were absolutely a tool of diplomacy, designed to impress foreign ambassadors and showcase Egypt's wealth and power. But these events were exercises in political theater, not mindless revelry. They were calculated displays meant to overwhelm guests with the sophistication and resources of the Ptolemaic kingdom. A visiting dignitary would leave having seen not just gold and silks, but also having engaged in stimulating conversation with renowned scholars, understanding that this was a court that valued brainpower as much as bullion. The real luxury of Cleopatra's palace wasn't the gold leaf on the walls. It was the access to the single greatest concentration of human knowledge on the planet. The greatest indulgence was the opportunity to learn, to debate, and to push the boundaries of what was known. So let's permanently retire the image of a non-stop orgy and replace it with a far more accurate and impressive picture. A queen holding court, surrounded not by carousing courtiers, but by the brilliant minds of her era, steering a nation with the power of intellect as much as the power of its throne. But despite her formidable intellect and the immense wealth at her command, the 10th massive misconception we need to tackle: is the assumption that Cleopatra's power as pharaoh was absolute and unchallenged across the entirety of Egypt's historical domain. The truth is far more complex and reveals the precarious tightrope she was forced to walk throughout her entire reign. She was indeed the pharaoh, the living embodiment of the goddess Isis on earth to her Egyptian subjects, and a Hellenistic basilissa or queen to her Greek-speaking administration. But her sovereignty was not the unchallenged, all-encompassing power of the great pharaohs of the Old or New Kingdoms. Instead, she ruled a client kingdom whose fate was increasingly dictated by the rising superpower of Rome, and her hold on power was a constant negotiation between internal factions and external threats. The geopolitical reality she inherited was one of severely diminished territory and influence. The once vast Ptolemaic Empire, which had at various times controlled Cyprus, parts of modern-day Libya, Syria, and Palestine, along with key coastal cities in Anatolia and the Aegean, had been shrinking for decades under the pressure of Roman expansion. Much of this contraction was the work of her own father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Gnathos or the Bastard. Desperate to secure Roman support for his shaky hold on the throne, he had made staggering concessions. He effectively turned Egypt into a client state of Rome, taking out massive loans from Roman bankers to bribe powerful senators, and even willing the entire kingdom of Egypt to the Roman people in his will, a move that hung over Cleopatra's entire reign like a sword of Damocles. By the time she took the throne, key territories like Cyprus had already been annexed by Rome, and the rich lands of Crete and Cyrenaica were firmly under Roman control. Her kingdom, though still unimaginably wealthy, was essentially Egypt proper and not much else. This meant that a significant portion of her foreign policy was not about expansion, but about survival and damage control. She wasn't dealing with Rome as an equal sovereign power. She was navigating a relationship with a protective but predatory overlord. The Roman Senate viewed Egypt and its vast grain reserves as a vital interest, and various powerful factions within Rome constantly jockeyed to be the one to exert influence over it. Cleopatra's genius was in playing this game masterfully. She understood that to rule Egypt, she first had to manage Rome. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were the ultimate expression of this strategy. By aligning herself with the most powerful Roman generals of her day, she wasn't just choosing lovers, she was appointing her own Roman patron, a personal protector who could shield her kingdom from the greed of other senators and delay the inevitable annexation. She was renting Roman military power to guarantee her own independence, an incredibly shrewd, if risky, geopolitical calculation. Internally, her power was also far from absolute. The Ptolemaic court in Alexandria was a snake pit of intrigue, with powerful Greek ministers, wealthy landowners, and a formidable military establishment all vying for influence. As a woman ruling alone, she faced constant challenges to her authority from those who believed a man should be on the throne. This is why she always ruled nominally with a male co-regent, first her younger brothers and later her son, Caesarion. These were not partnerships of equals, they were political necessities, legal fictions designed to placate traditionalists and provide a veneer of legitimacy. Furthermore, she had to carefully balance the interests of her two primary populations, the wealthy Greek elite in Alexandria who formed her administrative backbone, and the millions of native Egyptians whose labor and faith provided the kingdom's stability. Her adoption of Egyptian religion and dress wasn't just a personal choice. It was a vital political tool to secure the loyalty of the majority of her subjects and present a unified front. Every decision, from economic policy to religious ceremony, was a calculated move to maintain a fragile balance of power between Rome, her court, and her people. Her reign was a masterclass in holding a fractious and threatened kingdom together through sheer force of intellect, diplomacy, and political savvy. This intellectual pedigree brings us to the 11th enormous misconception, one that is perhaps the most personally insulting to her legacy. the idea that Cleopatra was uneducated or a simple-minded queen who ruled through charm alone. This could not be further from the truth. She was, in fact, the product of the finest education system in the ancient world, a true philosopher queen whose intellect was her most formidable weapon. As a Ptolemy, she was born into a dynasty that didn't just collect knowledge, they worshipped it. Her classroom was the great library of Alexandria and its attached research institute, the Museum, and her tutors were the greatest living minds of the Hellenistic age. Her curriculum was staggeringly comprehensive, designed to produce not just a ruler, but the ultimate Renaissance woman 17 centuries before the Renaissance. She was thoroughly schooled in mathematics and astronomy, essential for understanding the complex Egyptian calendar that dictated the all-important flooding of the Nile and for navigating her powerful navy. She mastered philosophy, engaging with the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, which provided the ethical and strategic framework for governance. Her training in oratory and rhetoric was particularly crucial. The power of her persuasive speech, noted by Plutarch, wasn't a natural gift, it was a finely honed skill, drilled into her through years of practice, allowing her to debate, negotiate, and command in multiple languages. She was also educated in medicine, a common pursuit for Hellenistic royalty, which would have given her a practical understanding of the health and well-being of her subjects. The most tantalizing evidence of her scholarly pursuits, however, comes from references to books she may have authored herself. Several ancient sources, including the Roman physician Galen, credit Cleopatra with writing a scholarly work on cosmetics and another on weights and measures in medicine. Another text, now lost, was attributed to her on the subject of alchemy. While we must be cautious, as famous names were often attached to anonymous works to give them authority, the consistency of these attributions suggests a ruler deeply engaged in the scientific and intellectual currents of her time. A book on cosmetics in the ancient world was not a frivolous fashion magazine. It was a serious pharmacological text dealing with the preparation of ointments, perfumes, and medical treatments. Her work on alchemy would have placed her at the forefront of the proto-scientific exploration of matter and transformation. This wasn't a queen dabbling in hobbies. This was a serious intellectual contributing to the scholarly discourse of her era. To view Cleopatra as anything less than a fiercely intelligent and highly educated sovereign is to completely misunderstand the source of her power. Her ability to engage Julius Caesar and Mark Antony as an equal wasn't just about charm or beauty, it was about meeting them on their own intellectual turf. She could discuss military strategy, political philosophy, and economic policy with the same depth and fluency as they could. She didn't just preside over the greatest repository of knowledge in the world, she was a living embodiment of its principles. In a world where most women, even royal ones, were denied formal education, Cleopatra's access to the Library of Alexandria made her one of the most learned people on the planet, man or woman. Her court was a salon of genius, and she was its brightest star, a monarch who wielded knowledge with the same authority as she wielded her scepter. This brings us to the 12th and perhaps most politically explosive misconception, a story that Octavian's propagandists had a field day with, the so-called donations of Alexandria, a lavish ceremony where Mark Antony is said to have whimsically given away vast chunks of the Roman Empire to Cleopatra and her children as personal gifts. This narrative, crafted to paint Antony as a drunken traitor and Cleopatra as a greedy queen coveting Rome's territory, is perhaps one of the most successful pieces of political spin in history. The reality was far more nuanced and strategically brilliant. This event was not a generous giveaway, it was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theater, a coronation ceremony designed to legitimize a new power structure in the Eastern Mediterranean and present a united Hellenistic Roman front against their common enemy, Octavian. To understand the donations, we must first look at a map of the world they were living in. The territories Antony gave away were not peaceful core Roman provinces like Italy or Gaul. They were the volatile eastern frontier regions, places like Armenia, which Antony had recently conquered, parts of Syria, Cilicia, and Cyrene. These were territories already under the joint military influence of Antony and Cleopatra, or were contested zones perpetually threatened by the powerful Parthian Empire. The ceremony, held in the Gymnasium of Alexandria in 34 BC, was Antony's way of formalizing a new administrative reality. He was creating a network of loyal client kingdoms ruled by his and Cleopatra's children, who would act as a buffer zone against Parthia and secure the eastern flank of the Roman world. It was a practical, strategic decision for governing a vast and unstable region, not a reckless dispersal of Roman land. The pageantry of the event was masterful political propaganda. Cleopatra was crowned Queen of Kings, and her son with Caesar, Caesarion, was proclaimed King of Kings and the legitimate heir to Egypt, a direct challenge to Octavian's claim to be Caesar's sole heir. Her children with Antony were given their own royal titles and territories. Alexander Helios was named King of Armenia and the lands beyond the Euphrates. His twin Cleopatra Selene was given Cyrenaica and Crete, and their young brother Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria and Cilicia. But we must see these titles for what they were, largely theoretical. These children were toddlers. They weren't expected to pack their bags and rule these kingdoms personally. The titles were symbolic, a way to project the image of a new, hereditary Ptolemaic Roman dynasty that could bring stability and legitimacy to the East. The real power would still be administered through Roman officials and military forces loyal to Antony. From Antony's perspective, this was also a bold challenge to the authority of the Senate in Rome, which was increasingly under Octavian's thumb. By appointing rulers himself, Antony was acting as a Roman triumvir, claiming his rightful authority to organize the provinces under his control. He was asserting that he, stationed in the east with his legions and his wealthy ally, had the power to make these decisions without seeking approval from a hostile Senate in Rome. For Cleopatra, the donations were the ultimate validation of her life's work. This was not about acquiring new baubles, it was about the official recognition of a restored Ptolemaic empire, a sphere of influence that echoed the glory of her ancestors, all achieved under her rule and secured through her partnership with Rome's most powerful general. It was the tangible promise of a future where Egypt was not a subordinate client kingdom, but the heart of a powerful Eastern co-empire, an equal partner to Rome. The donations of Alexandria weren't a romantic gift. They were a declaration of war against Octavian, not with swords but with symbols, and it was a declaration he would use to devastating effect in the propaganda war to come. And this careful cultivation of her image speaks directly to the 13th widespread belief we must dismantle the idea that Cleopatra was a despised tyrant, hated by her own Egyptian subjects and propped up solely by Roman spears. This misconception is a classic case of projecting the prejudices of her political enemies onto the general population. While it's certainly true that the small, elite circle of Greek courtiers in Alexandria viewed her cozy relationship with Rome with deep suspicion and often outright hostility, the evidence strongly suggests that among the vast millions of native Egyptians, Cleopatra was a popular and legitimate pharaoh. Her reign was not marked by the widespread revolts that had plagued some of her predecessors. Instead, she secured her hold on power by masterfully appealing to the people in the most profound ways possible. Her most powerful strategy was her wholehearted embrace of Egypt's ancient religion. She didn't just tolerate the local gods, she fully integrated herself into their divine narrative in a way no previous Ptolemaic ruler had dared. Most significantly, she identified herself explicitly as the living incarnation of the goddess Isis, the mother of Egypt and a deity associated with magic, healing, and protection. This was a stroke of political genius. Isis was arguably the most popular and beloved goddess in the entire Egyptian pantheon, worshipped by everyone from the highest priest to the lowest farmer. By wrapping herself in the mantle of Isis, Cleopatra transcended her foreign Macedonian origins and connected with her subjects on a deep spiritual level. In temple reliefs, she is depicted performing sacred rituals exactly as an Egyptian pharaoh would, making offerings to the gods and receiving their blessings in return. She built and restored temples dedicated to Egyptian deities, an act that demonstrated piety, provided employment, and earned the crucial support of the powerful priestly class. To the average Egyptian, she wasn't a foreign oppressor. She was the goddess queen who upheld Mat, the divine order of the universe. Furthermore, her decision to learn the Egyptian language cannot be overstated. For nearly 300 years, her Greek ancestors had ruled Egypt without bothering to learn the native tongue, conducting all business in Greek and relying entirely on translators. Cleopatra broke this mold. She was fluent in Egyptian, likely in multiple dialects, and could address her subjects, consult with priests, and administer justice in their own language. Imagine the powerful message this sent. For the first time in centuries, an Egyptian could approach their pharaoh and be understood directly without a Greek-speaking bureaucrat filtering their words. This act of cultural respect would have fostered immense goodwill and loyalty, making her feel accessible and invested in their well-being in a way her predecessors never were. On a practical level, her policies also likely contributed to her popularity. While detailed economic records are sparse, we know she skillfully managed a major famine by wisely distributing grain from the royal stores, preventing mass starvation and social unrest. A stable, well-fed population is a content population. She also understood that her power base relied on the prosperity of the country, which in turn depended on the labor and taxes of the Egyptian peasantry. It was in her direct interest to implement policies that ensured their relative well-being and the smooth functioning of the agricultural cycle. The lack of any major native-led revolts during her 22-year reign is the most telling evidence of all. The Egyptian people did not rise up to cast out a hated queen. They remained loyal to their Isis pharaoh until the very end, a testament to the powerful and genuine connection she had forged with the land she ruled. This grim reality of her children's fates after her death leads us to the 14th heartbreaking misconception, the idea that all of Cleopatra's children were immediately and mercilessly slaughtered by Octavian the moment he seized Egypt. While the story of her eldest son is indeed one of ruthless political assassination, the fates of her 3 younger children were far more complex, unfolding over years and revealing a chilling blend of calculated pragmatism and unexpected mercy from their conqueror. To understand their stories is to see the final, tragic chapter of the Ptolemaic dynasty play out not in a single bloody act, but in a slow, deliberate dismantling. The primary target from Octavian's perspective was always Caesarion. His very existence was an existential threat. His name, Ptolemy Caesar, said it all. He was the biological son of Julius Caesar, a living, breathing challenge to Octavian's carefully constructed identity as Caesar's sole adopted son and rightful heir. As long as Caesarion lived, he was a rallying point for any opposition to the new regime. The great Roman orator Cicero had once chillingly stated the prevailing Roman political wisdom, "Let there be no other Caesar." Octavian took this command to its logical conclusion. Despite initially offering the 17-year-old boy clemency, he was persuaded by his advisor Arrius Didymus, who reportedly told him, "It is not good to have too many Caesars." Caesarion was captured, likely as he tried to flee to ports on the Red Sea, and was executed. His death was not an act of rage. It was a cold, clinical elimination of a rival claimant, the final extinguishing of Julius Caesar's direct bloodline to secure Octavian's power. The treatment of Cleopatra's 3 children with Mark Antony, 10-year-old twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and their 6-year-old brother Ptolemy Philadelphus was different. They were too young to pose an immediate political threat, and their value to Octavian was as living trophies. they were taken to Rome and forced to walk in chains in his magnificent triumph parade in 29 BC, a brutal piece of political theater designed to humiliate the memory of their parents and glorify Octavian's victory. The image of these small, bewildered children dressed as the sun, the moon, and the conquered East, stumbling through the streets of Rome to the jeers of the crowd, is one of the most poignant and cruel moments in ancient history. It was a calculated act of psychological domination, meant to show that even the offspring of gods and kings were now subjects of Rome. After the triumph, their fates become shrouded in the mist of history, a common fate for political pawns who ceased to be useful. The boys Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus simply vanish from the historical record. Most historians agree they likely died of illness or were discreetly eliminated sometime during their adolescence in Rome, as they grew old enough to potentially become focal points for rebellion. Their sister, Cleopatra Selene, however, was granted a remarkable and unexpected second act. Recognizing her value as a political asset, Octavian arranged a strategic marriage for her around 20 BC. She was wed to Juba Roman II, the highly educated and Roman-friendly king of Numidia, who was later given the kingdom of Mauritania in North Africa. This was not an act of kindness but one of shrewd imperial policy. By marrying the daughter of Cleopatra and Mark Antony to a loyal client king, Octavian neutralized her as a threat while using her famous lineage to lend legitimacy and prestige to Juba's rule over a culturally mixed kingdom. But Cleopatra Selene did far more than just survive. She embraced her role with a strength that echoed her mother's. On coinage minted during their reign, her name often appears alongside or even before King Juba's. She became a powerful and respected co-ruler, helping to transform their capital, Caesarea, into a magnificent center of Hellenistic culture. She named her only son Ptolemy, a defiant nod to her glorious and tragic heritage. In this remote North African kingdom, the last surviving child of Cleopatra Roman VII found a way to become a queen in her own right, ruling wisely and leaving a legacy of stability and culture. A final, resilient echo of the Ptolemaic dynasty that refused to be completely silenced. Now, let's dismantle the 15th colossal misconception head-on: the enduring image of Cleopatra as a spendthrift queen who recklessly drained the Egyptian treasury to fund her own lavish lifestyle, frittering away a nation's wealth on pearls, parties, and personal indulgence. This caricature of a shopaholic monarch is another powerful fragment of Octavian's propaganda, designed to paint her as a decadent Eastern ruler who valued luxury over her people's welfare. The truth, as always, is far more strategic. While she absolutely engaged in breathtaking displays of opulence, every single act was a calculated investment in power projection, a form of economic and psychological warfare designed to awe allies, intimidate rivals, and reinforce her divine right to rule. The most famous anecdote, the story of her dissolving a priceless pearl earring in vinegar and drinking it to win a wager with Mark Antony, is the perfect example. At face value, it seems like the ultimate act of irresponsible extravagance, but when you examine the context, it transforms into a masterclass in political theater. The bet was over whether she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal. She allows Antony to believe he has won after a series of lavish courses, then produces the second largest pearl in history. As it dissolves, she declares that the cost of this final course alone far exceeds the wager's amount. This wasn't a foolish waste of money. It was a staggering demonstration of Egypt's incomprehensible wealth. She was sending a clear, undeniable message to Antony and every observer. The resources at her command were so vast that she could literally consume a fortune in a single gesture and hardly feel its loss. It was a power move designed to put the supposedly wealthiest man in the Roman world in his place and assert her position as an equal partner whose financial backing was not a gift but a strategic asset. This leads to the crucial point often missed. Egypt under Cleopatra was not a nation on the brink of bankruptcy. It was the Saudi Arabia of the ancient world, the undisputed economic superpower of the Mediterranean. The source of its wealth wasn't just gold from Nubian mines, it was the incredibly fertile floodplain of the Nile, which produced a massive surplus of grain year after year. Egypt was the breadbasket of the world, and control of its grain supply was a form of immense geopolitical leverage. Cleopatra didn't inherit an empty vault. She presided over the legendary treasury of the Ptolemies, a hoard of wealth that had been accumulating for nearly 3 centuries. Her challenge was never a lack of funds, but how to deploy that wealth most effectively to guarantee her kingdom's survival against the existential threat of Roman annexation. Her spending, therefore, was never frivolous. It was a core component of her foreign and domestic policy. The magnificent golden barge, the purple sails, the silver oars, and the servants dressed as sea nymphs were not just for her personal enjoyment. When she arrived to meet Mark Antony at Tarsus, this spectacle was a diplomatic weapon. It was a mobile, breathtaking advertisement of Egypt's power, designed to overwhelm Antony's senses and immediately establish her not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign whose resources could make or break his military ambitions. The message was clear: this is the power that stands behind me, ally with me, and all of this can be yours. Internally, this opulence served a vital purpose in maintaining the loyalty of her key constituencies. For the native Egyptian population, her lavish patronage of temples and participation in elaborate religious festivals reinforced her image as a divine pharaoh, a living goddess who upheld the cosmic order. For the Greek elite in Alexandria, the splendid court, the funding of the library, and the sponsorship of philosophers and poets maintained the city's status as the cultural capital of the world, affirming their privileged position and giving them a stake in her continued rule. Even the famous pearl was not truly wasted. Its value was instantly converted into something far more valuable, a legendary story that enhanced her mystique and demonstrated her absolute command over material resources. Every drachma spent was intended to generate a return in the form of political stability, military security, or enhanced legitimacy. She wasn't burning through the treasury. She was fueling the engine of her statecraft with it, understanding that in the ancient world, the perception of power was often just as important as its reality. But the true story of the Battle of Actium is far more complex and strategically nuanced than a simple tale of a queen's cowardice causing a defeat. To understand what really happened in that Greek harbor in 31 BC, we must first discard the simplistic naval battle narrative. Actium was a massive combined arms siege operation. Octavian's brilliant general, Agrippa, had blockaded Antony and Cleopatra's fleet inside the Ambracian Gulf, while Octavian's land forces besieged their army on the surrounding promontory. The real enemy wasn't just the Roman fleet, it was disease and starvation. Antony's camp was being decimated by malaria and dwindling supplies, trapped in a stranglehold. The famous sea battle, therefore, was not a spontaneous clash but a desperate breakout attempt, a pre-planned maneuver to escape the trap and regroup in their power base of Egypt. The core of this planned maneuver likely revolved around Cleopatra's squadron. Her 60 Egyptian warships were not the heavy, slow quadriremes and quinquiremes that made up the bulk of the battle line. They were faster, more agile vessels, and crucially, they carried the campaign's war chest. The strategy appears to have been a classic hammer and anvil tactic. Antony's heavy ships would engage Agrippa's fleet head-on, creating a massive, chaotic melee in the center. In the confusion, Cleopatra's squadron, held in the rear, would raise their sails, an unusual act for a ship preparing to fight, and punch through a gap in Octavian's line. They weren't fleeing the battle, they were executing their designated role, breaking the blockade to preserve the treasury and the command structure, saving the assets necessary to fight another day. The plan began to unravel not when Cleopatra moved, but when Antony did. As her ships successfully broke through the Roman line, Antony himself abandoned his flagship, transferred to a faster vessel, and followed her. This was the critical, catastrophic mistake. With both commanders suddenly disengaging and sailing away, the morale of the entire Antonian fleet collapsed instantly. The men who were still locked in brutal combat saw their leaders apparently deserting them and lost all will to fight. The fleet that had been holding its own against Agrippa's forces surrendered or was destroyed not because it was being defeated, but because its heart had been ripped out. Antony's decision to follow Cleopatra transformed a risky but calculated strategic withdrawal into a panicked, leaderless rout. The Roman propaganda machine, overseen by Octavian, seized on this moment with vicious efficiency. They couldn't admit that they had been outmaneuvered or that their victory was due to an enemy plan that almost worked. Instead, they crafted the perfect, misogynistic narrative. The brave Roman general Antony had been unmanned and bewitched by the Oriental temptress, and in the moment of crisis, her cowardly, feminine nature took over, causing her to flee and him to abandon his duty to follow her. This story neatly erased Antony's own fatal error in judgment and reduced Cleopatra's role to that of a hysterical woman, her carefully orchestrated military operation recast as a shameful flight. The truth is, her escape was likely the only part of the plan that worked correctly. The failure was in the execution and communication, leaving the main fleet to its fate and handing Octavian a devastating propaganda victory that would define the story of Actium for the next 2,000 years. This brings us to a 17th point that seems straightforward on its surface, but reveals a profound historical shift upon closer examination. It is absolutely true that Cleopatra VII was the last pharaoh of Egypt, but this statement requires a crucial, game-changing clarification. She was not the final person to ever hold the title of pharaoh. Rather, she was the very last independent, native-based ruler of a sovereign pharaonic Egypt. Her death didn't erase the title from existence, but it did mark the catastrophic end of 3,000 years of Egyptian self-rule, transforming the Nile Valley from a powerful, autonomous kingdom into a conquered Roman province. To understand this distinction, we need to look at what happened immediately after Octavian's forces took control of Alexandria. He didn't abolish the ancient Egyptian office of pharaoh, he effectively absorbed it. Egypt became the personal property of the Roman emperor, a breadbasket so vital to Rome's survival that its grain supply and immense wealth were considered far too important to be entrusted to the usual senatorial administration. For the next several centuries, Roman emperors, from Augustus himself all the way through the likes of Diocletian, were depicted in Egyptian temple reliefs and monuments wearing the traditional regalia of the pharaoh. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the Nemes headcloth, and the false beard. They were shown making offerings to Egyptian gods like Amun-Ra and Horus, performing the sacred rituals that had been the pharaoh's duty for millennia. In the eyes of the Egyptian priesthood and people, the Roman emperor was the pharaoh, the latest incarnation of the god Horus on earth, responsible for maintaining Mat or cosmic order. So, in a strictly technical sense, the line of pharaohs continued unbroken, but the reality on the ground was a world apart. These Roman pharaohs were distant, absentee landlords who never set foot in Egypt to perform their divine duties. They ruled through a ruthless and efficient Roman prefect stationed in Alexandria, whose primary concerns were extracting the maximum amount of grain and taxes and ensuring no rival general could ever use the province as a base to challenge the emperor's power. The vast treasures of Egypt now flowed directly into the imperial coffers in Rome, funding legions and building monuments in a foreign land. The ancient title of pharaoh, once the embodiment of a god-king who was the spiritual and political heart of his nation, had been reduced to a hollow piece of imperial propaganda, a cynical concession to local tradition designed to keep the population passive and productive. This is why Cleopatra's reign is such a monumental watershed. She was the last in an unbroken line of rulers stretching back through the Ptolemies, the Nubians, the New Kingdom giants, and the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom who ruled Egypt from within Egypt for Egypt. She was the final sovereign who spoke the language, worshipped the gods, and fought for the independence of the two lands. The Roman emperors who followed were pharaohs in name and iconography only. They were foreign conquerors administering a resource colony. Cleopatra's death, therefore, wasn't just the end of a dynasty. It was the death of a 3,000-year-old civilization as an independent entity. The soul of pharaonic Egypt died with her on that day in 30 BC, even if its empty title and artistic shell were preserved for centuries by its new Roman masters. This youthful ascent to power leads us directly into the 18th massive misconception that softens her true nature, the idea that Cleopatra was a mere child when she became queen, a naive girl thrust onto the throne by circumstance. While she was indeed very young, the reality is far more impressive. She wasn't a wide-eyed adolescent. She was an 18-year-old who had already received years of rigorous political and strategic training, a prepared monarch stepping into a role she was groomed to inherit, not a helpless pawn suddenly finding herself in charge. Let's clarify the timeline precisely because it reveals a critical period of apprenticeship. Cleopatra first became co-ruler with her father, Ptolemy XII, around 51 BC when she was 18 years old. This was not a ceremonial title. For the final 4 years of her father's chaotic reign, she was his active partner in governance. This was her political boot camp. She witnessed firsthand her father's desperate struggles to maintain power, including his massive bribes to Roman politicians and his eventual flight to Rome to beg for military support to reclaim his throne. She saw the immense pressure Rome could exert and learned the delicate, expensive art of managing that relationship. She observed the cutthroat politics of the Alexandrian court, the constant jockeying for influence among powerful ministers and generals. This 4-year co-regency was an invaluable, immersive education in crisis management, providing her with a practical understanding of power that no classroom could ever offer. When her father died in 51 BC, she didn't jump from student to absolute ruler. According to his will, she was required to enter a new co-regency, this time with her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 10 years old. This was a standard Ptolemaic practice designed to provide stability and a male figurehead, but Cleopatra had no intention of sharing real power with a child controlled by a cabal of scheming advisors. From the very beginning, she asserted her dominance. Ancient papyri from this period show a telling detail. Her name was written before his in official documents, and she issued decrees under her own authority alone. For the first 3 years of this joint rule, from age 21 to 24, she was the undisputed power in Alexandria, effectively ruling solo while her brother's regents grew increasingly hostile to her independence. This context completely shatters the image of an inexperienced girl. By the time her brother's faction finally forced her to flee Alexandria, triggering the chain of events that would lead to her famous meeting with Julius Caesar, Cleopatra was not some political novice. She was a 21-year-old woman who had already been a working head of state for 3 years, with an additional 4 years of direct training as her father's co-regent. She had 7 years of high-stakes political experience. She understood the intricacies of Egypt's economy, the complexities of its relationship with Rome, and the venomous nature of its court politics. This was not a child playing queen. This was a seasoned, albeit young, political operator fighting to hold onto the power she had already been wielding for years. Her bold decision to have herself smuggled to Caesar wasn't the act of a desperate girl. It was the calculated gamble of a deposed CEO using every asset at her disposal to stage a corporate takeover and reclaim her company. Her youth was a fact, but her expertise was hard-earned, and it was this foundation that allowed her to engage with the Roman dictator not as a frightened supplicant, but as a fellow ruler and strategic equal. This brings us to the 19th startling fact, one that often shocks modern audiences. Cleopatra was legally married to not one, but 2 of her own younger brothers. This wasn't a rare personal quirk or a sign of deviant behavior. It was standard operating procedure for the Ptolemaic dynasty, a bizarre but calculated political strategy that had been the family business for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies, as foreign Greek rulers in Egypt, were obsessed with maintaining the purity of their Macedonian bloodline and preventing their vast wealth and power from being diluted by sharing it with the native Egyptian aristocracy. Their solution was as simple as it was shocking. They kept everything in the family. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, creating a closed dynastic loop where power could be consolidated and the throne protected from outside claims. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died, his will explicitly stated that Cleopatra, then about 18 years old, was to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only around 10. This was not a suggestion, it was a legal requirement for her to claim power. Their marriage was a formality, a piece of political theater designed to present a unified, traditional front to the Egyptian people and the wider world. It was a marriage in name only, a constitutional fiction. There was no romantic attachment or even a household to share. They were co-rulers, and from the very beginning, Cleopatra made it clear who was in charge. She issued decrees in her name first, and her face alone appeared on coinage. She effectively sidelined the child king and the cabal of regents who sought to control him, ruling as the sole sovereign for the first 3 years of their joint reign. This situation was, of course, intolerable to those powerful advisors. They eventually succeeded in turning Ptolemy XIII against his sister wife, driving her out of Alexandria and triggering the civil war that would ultimately bring Julius Caesar to Egypt. After Caesar helped her defeat and drown her first brother husband in the Nile, Cleopatra found herself in a familiar bind. Roman and Egyptian law still required a male co-regent for legitimacy. With breathtaking practicality, she simply installed her next youngest brother, the 11-year-old Ptolemy XIV, as her new nominal husband and co-ruler around 47 BC. This was an even more transparent charade than the first. The boy was a mere placeholder, a puppet king who allowed her to technically obey the letter of the law while she held all the real power, especially after she gave birth to Caesar's son, Caesarion, who she envisioned as her true heir. Ptolemy XIV's reign was brief and uneventful, and he conveniently died just a few years later, around the time Cleopatra returned from her lavish visit to Rome. While no ancient source explicitly states it, the overwhelming consensus among historians is that the young king was almost certainly poisoned on her orders. He had simply outlived his usefulness, with her son Caesarion now old enough to be elevated as her co-regent. A second brother husband was no longer necessary. This cold, calculated move finally allowed her to shed the fiction of a marriage and rule alongside the child who truly represented her dynastic ambitions, closing the book on the brother husbands and clearing the path for her own chosen lineage. And this meticulous attention to her official titles brings us directly to the 20th fundamental detail that often gets blurred in popular memory. When we say Cleopatra, we think of one specific iconic woman, but in the context of her own family and time, the name was about as unique as Elizabeth in the British royal family. Her full, formal name was Cleopatra VII Philopator, and every single part of that name was a carefully chosen tool in her arsenal of political legitimacy. The name Cleopatra itself, which translates from Greek to mean glory of her father, was a dynastic staple, a brand name used by the Ptolemaic royal house for generations. She was not the first, nor even the second, but the 7th queen to bear that name. Her own grandmother was Cleopatra V, and there were numerous other Cleopatras scattered throughout the family tree, some of whom ruled as powerful regents or co-regents in their own right. This is why historians use the numeral 7. It is the essential differentiator that separates the famous queen from her many namesakes. To her contemporaries, simply saying Queen Cleopatra could have been ambiguous, calling her Cleopatra Philopator was what specified exactly which Cleopatra they were talking about. The epithet Philopater, meaning father-loving, was far more than a sentimental nickname. It was an official title she adopted and prominently used on official documents and inscriptions, and its purpose was intensely political. In the wake of her father's death, her hold on the throne was immediately challenged by her brother's faction. By branding herself as father-loving, she was making a powerful public statement about her legitimacy. She was positioning herself as her father's true, devoted heir, the one who would honor his policies and continue his legacy. This was a direct contrast to her siblings and their advisors, who were effectively staging a coup against the succession plan outlined in Ptolemy XII's will. In the cutthroat world of Ptolemaic politics, claiming to be your father's favorite was a claim to his power. It was a rhetorical move designed to solidify the support of those still loyal to the previous king and frame her opponents as illegitimate usurpers. So the next time you hear her name, remember that it wasn't just a personal identifier. It was a loaded political statement, a claim to the throne, and a piece of propaganda all rolled into one. Cleopatra VII Philopater wasn't just a queen, she was a brand, and she managed her image right down to the very name she used. While we often envision Cleopatra presiding eternally from her golden throne in Alexandria, the 21st major misconception paints her as a stationary queen forever confined within Egypt's borders. The reality is that she was a highly mobile head of state, a world traveler who strategically positioned herself at the centers of power throughout the Mediterranean to protect her kingdom's interests. Her most documented and politically explosive journey was her extended stay in Rome as the personal guest of Julius Caesar, a visit that utterly scandalized the conservative Roman elite and demonstrated her formidable presence on the world stage. Caesar installed her and their infant son, Caesarion, in his luxurious villa across the Tiber River, a move that was both a personal gesture and a profound political statement. For the Romans, this was an unprecedented situation. A foreign monarch, a woman from a culture they viewed as decadent and inferior, was now residing in their very capital at the invitation of the Republic's most powerful man. She wasn't just visiting, she held court, engaging with senators, intellectuals, and diplomats, effectively acting as the recognized queen of Egypt from a Roman hillside. The conservative aristocracy, led by figures like the orator Cicero, was apoplectic. They saw her as a dangerous, corrupting influence, a living embodiment of the Eastern luxury and monarchy that threatened their republican values. Cicero himself wrote scathing letters complaining about her arrogance and his own awkward interactions with her, a clear sign of the discomfort she provoked in the old guard. Her very presence forced Roman society to confront the increasing power of the Hellenistic world and the shifting dynamics of their own republic. The scandal culminated when Caesar daringly had a gilded statue of her erected in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the mythical ancestor of his family, openly linking her and their son to the very foundations of Roman identity. This was no quiet diplomatic visit. It was a bold, in-your-face assertion of her place in the New World Order Caesar was building, and it made her powerful enemies who would never forget her perceived intrusion. Beyond this famous Roman sojourn, her role as a key ally to Mark Antony necessitated further extensive travel. This was not a queen who remained safely in her palace while her generals waged war. She was an active participant in the campaign planning and logistics. Ancient sources strongly suggest she accompanied Antony on his military expeditions across the eastern Mediterranean, particularly during his ill-fated campaign against the Parthian Empire. She wasn't there as a decorative companion. She was the commander of her own forces and the paymaster of the entire operation. Her presence ensured that the vast resources of Egypt, the grain, the gold, the ships, were deployed effectively, and that her interests were directly represented in every strategic decision. Imagine her not in a palanquin, but in a command tent, reviewing maps with Antony and his generals, her fluency in multiple languages and deep understanding of regional politics making her an invaluable strategic asset. She would have traveled to key allied cities, reinforcing diplomatic ties and showcasing the strength of their joint authority. This mobility was a critical component of her rule. By moving through the eastern Mediterranean, she projected Egyptian power beyond its borders, reassured client kings of her support, and personally managed the most important relationship guaranteeing her nation's survival. Her throne was not fixed in Alexandria, it was wherever she needed to be to secure the future of her kingdom. When you picture Cleopatra in your mind, you're almost certainly seeing the iconic Hollywood image, a stunning woman draped in sleek black wigs, a golden headdress featuring a rearing cobra, and heavy, elaborate eye makeup. This visual has been burned into our collective consciousness by decades of cinema, but it's our 22nd major misconception. The reality of Cleopatra's royal regalia was far more nuanced and strategically calculated than any movie costume designer has ever captured. She wasn't simply wearing traditional Egyptian dress, she was expertly curating a hybrid wardrobe, a fusion of Hellenistic and Egyptian elements designed to send specific political messages to different segments of her audience. As a Greek-Macedonian ruler of Egypt, her day-to-day attire within the walls of her palace in Alexandria would have been thoroughly Hellenistic. She likely wore the elegant, draped garments of the Greek world, a finely woven chiton or a peplos, perhaps dyed with expensive purple or saffron, and accessorized with gold jewelry featuring Greek motifs like meanders, palmettes, and intricate granulation work. This was the clothing of her culture and her court, a visual affirmation of her Ptolemaic heritage to the Greek elite who formed her administrative backbone. But when it was time to present herself to the wider Egyptian population or to commission official state art, she underwent a calculated transformation. She adopted the powerful symbols of the pharaohs, but often with a Hellenistic twist. For her official portraits on temple walls and state-issued coinage, Cleopatra harnessed the traditional iconography of Egyptian power with precision. She would have been depicted wearing the kepresh, the striking blue war crown adorned with golden discs, a symbol of her military might and royal authority. She also wore the magnificent vulture headdress, its body covering her head and its wings draped down beside her face. This was not merely a decorative piece. The vulture was a symbol of the goddess's neckbit and mutt, but most importantly, it was associated with Isis, the very deity Cleopatra claimed to incarnate. This headdress visually screamed her divine right to rule to every Egyptian subject who laid eyes on it. Yet, even in these traditional depictions, a trained eye can sometimes spot the fusion. The facial features in many of her statues while wearing Egyptian crowns are rendered with the softer, more idealized naturalism of Greek sculpture rather than the strict, rigid profile of traditional Egyptian art. Her famous profile on coins with its prominent nose, strong chin, and intelligent gaze is unmistakably Hellenistic, a realistic portrait of a thinking ruler, not a stylized god-king. The most telling evidence of this sartorial synthesis comes from archaeology. A famous painted statue from Herculaneum, believed to depict Cleopatra, shows her wearing a golden diadem, a simple ribbon tied around her head that was the quintessential symbol of Hellenistic monarchy, while simultaneously carrying a cornucopia, a symbol of fertility and abundance that resonated with both Greek and Egyptian audiences. She didn't choose one identity over the other. She masterfully combined them, creating a unique visual language that said, "I am your Greek queen and your Egyptian pharaoh all at once." Even the uraeus, the sacred cobra so prominent on movie headdresses, was used strategically. It was a potent symbol of protection and royalty, but its placement and style would have adhered to specific traditional protocols, not the fanciful designs dreamed up in a Hollywood wardrobe department. Her wardrobe was a diplomatic tool, each crown, each piece of jewelry, and each garment selected to reinforce her legitimacy. appease a particular constituency, and project an image of unified, divine power that was both timeless and uniquely her own. Furthermore, we must completely dismantle the 23rd and perhaps most dismissive misconception of all: the notion that Cleopatra's reign was a brief, forgettable blip on the historical radar, an insignificant prelude to the inevitable Roman conquest. This could not be more false. Her 22-year rule from 51 to 30 BC was not a short stint. It was a marathon of political endurance, a remarkably long and stable period of governance that stands as a towering testament to her skill, especially when you consider the catastrophic pressure she was under from the moment she took the throne. To put this into perspective, longevity was a rare commodity in the cutthroat world of Hellenistic monarchy and late Roman Republican politics. Many of her contemporaries, both in the East and in Rome itself, met violent, premature ends. Her own father faced exile and had to buy his way back to power with Roman gold. Her brother and rival, Ptolemy XIII, was dead by 14, drowned in the Nile. The Roman strongmen she dealt with, Pompey, Caesar, Cicero, Cassius, Brutus, all died assassinated or in battle. Mark Antony, her partner for a decade, ultimately took his own life. Even her conqueror, Octavian, spent his reign fending off conspiracies and paranoia. In this bloody context, ruling a wealthy, coveted kingdom for over 2 decades was an almost superhuman achievement. It speaks not to luck, but to a profound and sustained mastery of statecraft, crisis management, and diplomatic foresight. Her reign was not a period of quiet decline. It was an active, continuous campaign to preserve Egyptian sovereignty against an existential threat. She didn't just react to events, she shaped them. She successfully navigated not one, but 2 devastating Roman civil wars, first between Caesar and Pompey, and later between the Second Triumvirate and Caesar's assassins. In each conflict, she had to choose a side, calculate the risk, and commit her kingdom's resources without any guarantee of the outcome, a diplomatic tightrope walk that would have broken a lesser ruler. When famine struck the eastern Mediterranean, she didn't retreat behind her palace walls. She implemented a brilliant economic strategy, managing her grain reserves with the precision of a modern central banker to prevent starvation at home and generate wealth abroad. She fought a naval war against Cassius, who had seized Roman-controlled Syria and was preparing to invade Egypt for its wealth. She personally led her fleet to join forces with Antony and Octavian, a bold move that, while ultimately unsuccessful due to a storm, demonstrated her willingness to engage militarily to protect her interests. Her ultimate goal was never mere survival. It was the restoration of the Ptolemaic Empire to its former glory. Through her partnership with Mark Antony, she nearly achieved it. The donations of Alexandria, while a propaganda gift to Octavian, represented the peak of her ambition, a vision of a restored Hellenistic East, with her children ruling a network of client kingdoms under her and Antony's protection, creating a power block that could stand as a genuine equal to Rome. That this vision ultimately failed does not diminish the sheer audacity and political muscle it took to get that close. For 22 years, she played the most dangerous game imaginable against the most powerful adversaries in the world, and she played it so well that she kept her nation independent, prosperous, and out of Roman hands for a generation longer than anyone had any right to expect. Her reign was not short or insignificant. It was the final, brilliant, and defiant flame of pharaonic Egypt, burning brightly against the encroaching darkness of Roman imperialism until its very last breath. This brings us to a 24th and particularly grim chapter in Cleopatra's story, one that showcases the cold, ruthless pragmatism that lay beneath the glamorous exterior. We've already discussed her 2 brother husbands, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. The first died in open warfare, drowned in the Nile during a civil war. The death of the second, however, is shrouded in a much darker and more suspicious cloud. The overwhelming historical consensus, though it cannot be proven with absolute certainty, is that Cleopatra almost certainly ordered the assassination of her younger sibling to remove a political obstacle and clear the path for her own bloodline. To understand why this drastic act was necessary, we need to look at the political chessboard in the years following Julius Caesar's departure from Egypt. After Caesar helped her defeat Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra was once again bound by law and tradition to have a male co-regent. She installed her 11-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIV, around 47 BC. This was a purely formal arrangement, a legal fiction designed to placate traditionalists while she held all the real power. For a few years, the young king was a useful puppet, a harmless figurehead who gave her reign a veneer of constitutional legitimacy. The calculus changed dramatically with the birth of her son by Julius Caesar, Ptolemy Caesar, known lovingly as Caesarion. This child was everything to her. He was not just a son, he was the living embodiment of her alliance with the most powerful man in the Roman world, a child with the divine blood of the Ptolemies and the formidable lineage of the Julii. He represented the future, a future where Egypt could be ruled by a dynasty with direct ties to Rome, potentially securing its independence for generations to come. As Caesarion grew from an infant into a young boy, the presence of the teenage Ptolemy XIV became not just unnecessary but actively dangerous. He was a rival claimant to the throne, a focal point around which any opposition to her rule could coalesce. As long as he lived, he was a threat to her son's inheritance. Then, around 44 BC, Ptolemy XIV suddenly and conveniently died. The timing is deeply incriminating. Cleopatra had just returned from a long and politically charged visit to Rome. Caesar had been assassinated, throwing the Roman world into chaos and leaving her position more vulnerable. She needed to solidify her power base in Egypt immediately. With Caesarion now around 3 years old, an age where he could, however nominally, be presented as a co-ruler, the older brother had simply outlived his usefulness. There was no messy civil war, no public battle. The young king just disappeared from the historical record. Ancient sources like the historian Josephus flatly state that he was poisoned on her orders. While no one could produce a smoking gun, the circumstances point overwhelmingly to a calculated political murder. This was not an act of passionate rage. It was a cold, dispassionate decision made by a head of state who understood that sentimentality had no place in the fight for survival. In the brutal world of Ptolemaic politics, where sibling rivalry often ended in bloodshed, her actions were grimly conventional. She was playing by the established, vicious rules of her own dynasty. By eliminating Ptolemy XIV, she wasn't just removing a rival, she was proactively securing her throne for her chosen heir, ensuring a smooth transition of power and preventing a potential civil war down the line. It was a stark demonstration that behind the scholar, the diplomat, and the charismatic leader, Cleopatra possessed the same steel-hearted resolve as any Roman general or Ptolemaic predecessor. She would do whatever it took to protect her kingdom and her son's future, even if it meant crossing the most horrific moral line imaginable. But this leads us directly to the 25th and perhaps most politically charged misconception of all, the oversimplified notion that Cleopatra was ultimately defeated because she was a woman. While her gender was weaponized against her with devastating effect in the propaganda war, to attribute her loss to this single factor is to ignore the complex geopolitical and military realities of the conflict. She wasn't defeated because she was a woman. She was defeated because she backed the losing side in a brutal Roman civil war against one of the most ruthlessly effective political and military machines ever assembled, led by the future Emperor Augustus. The core of the conflict was not a clash of genders, but a clash of empires and ambitions. The Battle of Actium was not Rome versus Egypt. It was the final showdown between two factions of the Roman world, Octavian's forces in the west versus the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the east. Antony was a Roman triumvir, and a significant portion of his army and fleet were Roman legions and senators loyal to him. Cleopatra's role was that of a key ally, the ruler of the wealthiest client kingdom, who had thrown her immense resources and powerful navy behind Antony's cause. They lost not because of her feminine leadership, but because of a combination of strategic errors, poor logistics, and the sheer tactical brilliance of Octavian's right-hand man, General Agrippa. Agrippa's naval innovations and his successful blockade that trapped Antony's fleet and army, leading to disease and desertion, were the decisive military factors. The outcome was a result of superior strategy on Octavian's part, not a failure of nerve or ability on Cleopatra's. Where her gender becomes critically important is in the aftermath, in the story that was crafted to explain that defeat. The victorious Octavian faced a problem. He could not return to Rome and celebrate a triumph over another Roman, Mark Antony. That would highlight the ugly truth of a civil war. Instead, he had to frame it as a glorious foreign war against a dangerous external threat. But that threat was a woman, and being defeated by a woman was the ultimate humiliation for the Roman masculine ideal. The solution was a masterclass in propaganda. Octavian's faction systematically erased Cleopatra's political and military authority. They could not admit that Rome had been challenged by a strategic genius and an equal sovereign. Instead, they recast her as a monstrous, emasculating seductress. Her intelligence became witchcraft. Her strategic alliance with Antony became a sordid affair where she had enslaved a great Roman general with her sexual magic. Her leadership in the war was reduced to hysterical cowardice. Her prudent withdrawal at Actium spun as a panicked flight that Antony was too lovesick to resist. This propaganda was incredibly effective because it played on deep-seated Roman fears and prejudices about powerful women and Eastern decadence. It allowed Octavian to claim he had not defeated a fellow Roman, but had instead liberated Antony from the clutches of a foreign sorceress and saved Rome from her effeminate influence. Her gender was the canvas on which Octavian painted his victory, transforming a complex military and political defeat into a simple, morally satisfying story of Roman virtue overcoming Oriental depravity. So, while her gender was not the cause of her military defeat, it was the primary lens through which that defeat was interpreted and remembered for centuries. The real story is that a brilliant leader lost a high-stakes war to an even more brilliant opponent. The myth we inherited is that a woman's emotional weakness doomed her side, a narrative that says far more about the insecurities of the victors than it does about the capabilities of history's most formidable queen. Now let's tackle one of the most bizarre and persistent myths that circulates online: the claim that Cleopatra invented the world's first vibrator by filling a hollowed-out gourd with angry bees. This peculiar story has gained traction on social media and various websites, often presented as a titillating historical fact about the Queen's supposed sexual inventiveness. However, when we apply even the most basic historical scrutiny, this tale completely falls apart, revealing itself as almost certainly a modern fabrication or a gross misinterpretation that has been wrongly attached to Cleopatra's name. The first and most significant problem with this story is the complete absence of any credible historical evidence. There exists no mention of such a device in any ancient Egyptian texts, no description in Greek or Roman accounts of Cleopatra's life, and no archaeological evidence whatsoever to support this claim. Our most detailed sources about Cleopatra, historians like Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and Suetonius, who documented everything from her diplomatic strategies to her personal relationships, make no reference to any such invention. These were writers who were often eager to include salacious details about her life as part of Roman propaganda campaigns. If there had been even a whisper of such a bizarre contraption, they would have undoubtedly seized upon it to further their narrative of her as a decadent and unnatural woman. The silence from primary sources is deafening and strongly suggests this story originated centuries after her death. So where did this myth come from? The most likely explanation points to a case of historical telephone game, where a fragment of information from a different context gets distorted and reassigned to a famous figure. There are ancient texts that discuss using bee vibrations for medicinal purposes, not for pleasure. The Greek physician Pedanius Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century AD, mentioned using bee vibrations to treat gout and other joint ailments. In a completely separate tradition, there are references in various cultures to using insects for their buzzing properties in different contexts. At some point in the modern era, likely with the rise of the internet, these disparate fragments appear to have been mashed together and sensationalistically attached to history's most famous queen, creating a viral but completely unsubstantiated story that plays into modern fantasies about ancient sexuality. The practical impossibility of this supposed invention further reveals its mythical nature. Consider the logistics: obtaining and containing angry bees in a gourd without being stung repeatedly would have been extraordinarily dangerous and difficult with ancient technology. Bees agitated enough to produce significant vibration would likely be defensive and aggressive, making the proposed use not just impractical but downright hazardous. Furthermore, the notion that a ruler of Cleopatra's intellect and status would engage in such a risky and undignified experiment strains credulity. This was a queen who had access to the finest perfumes, oils, and luxurious materials in the ancient world. The idea that she would resort to wrestling with aggressive insects inside a vegetable for pleasure, rather than using any of the numerous documented ancient methods for sexual stimulation, doesn't align with what we know about ancient practices or her position. Ultimately, this myth persists because it fits into a long tradition of reducing historical women to their sexuality and attributing sensationalized sexual stories to them, particularly those who exercised power in ways that made later societies uncomfortable. Cleopatra has been a particular victim of this tendency for 2 millennia, with each generation projecting its own fantasies and anxieties onto her story. The angry bees in a gourd tale is simply the latest iteration of this phenomenon, a viral, clickbait-friendly story that prioritizes sensationalism over historical accuracy. It tells us much more about modern internet culture's appetite for quirky historical anecdotes than it does about the real Cleopatra, whose actual innovations and accomplishments in politics, economics, and diplomacy were far more revolutionary than any fictionalized bedroom invention could ever be. This brings us to an essential piece of context that often gets lost in her singular fame. Cleopatra VII was not the first of her name. She was the 7th Ptolemaic ruler to bear that title, standing on the shoulders of a dynasty filled with formidable women who had been wielding power and navigating treacherous political waters for generations. Understanding this lineage is crucial because it completely reframes her story. She wasn't a miraculous anomaly who appeared out of nowhere. She was the culmination of a long tradition of powerful Ptolemaic queens and regents, the latest and greatest product of a system that, for all its flaws, had created a space for women to rule. Let's meet some of these earlier Cleopatras, starting with her own direct ancestors. Her grandmother was Cleopatra V, who co-ruled with her father, Ptolemy XII, and was likely also his sister following the family's tradition. While the historical record for her is patchy, her mere presence as a co-regent was significant, setting a precedent for female authority. More prominent still was Cleopatra III, our queen's great-grandmother, who was a force of nature in her own right. She didn't just advise her sons, she actively co-ruled with them and even pushed them out of power when they disagreed with her. She was so powerful that she was officially deified as Cleopatra the Goddess Mother, and her will was a dominant political document that shaped the succession for years after her death. Then there was Cleopatra Thea, who ruled the Seleucid Empire, a neighboring Hellenistic kingdom, and was notorious for her ruthless political maneuvers, even allegedly poisoning her own son to maintain control. These were the role models in Cleopatra, the seventh family tree women who commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and held ultimate power in a man's world. This context is vital because it shatters the illusion that she was operating in a vacuum or that her assertiveness was somehow unnatural for her time and station. From her earliest childhood, she would have been immersed in the stories of these formidable ancestors. Her education would not have just been in philosophy and languages. It would have included lessons in the realpolitik of her dynasty, studying how her great-grandmother managed to control the army or how her grandmother maintained her influence. The palace corridors of Alexandria were haunted by the ghosts of these powerful women, and their examples provided a blueprint for how a queen could rule, not just reign. She learned from both their triumphs and their failures, understanding the delicate balance of collaborating with powerful Roman officials while fiercely guarding Egyptian interests. This rich family history makes her own achievements not less impressive but far more understandable. She inherited a playbook written by generations of clever, determined women who had refined the art of Ptolemaic rule. What set her apart was the scale of the challenge she faced, the overwhelming and imminent threat of Roman annexation, and the breathtaking audacity of her response. While her predecessors worked to maintain the status quo within the Hellenistic world, Cleopatra VII played for the highest stakes imaginable, attempting to outmaneuver Rome itself and secure her dynasty's future through strategic alliances at the very top of the Roman power structure. She took the tools she inherited: the political savvy, the economic acumen, the willingness to engage in the brutal realpolitik of her family, and deployed them on a global stage against opponents unlike any her ancestors had ever faced. Her fame is deserved, but it should not eclipse the powerful queens who came before her, the women who proved that a Cleopatra could rule, and in doing so paved the way for the most famous one of all. And this fascination with her legendary allure brings us to the 28th assumption: we must demystify the idea that Cleopatra possessed some exotic, secret beauty routine lost to history, a magical arsenal of mysterious potions and unattainable ingredients that granted her an otherworldly glow. While she certainly had access to the finest materials the ancient world could offer, her daily rituals were not composed of magical secrets, but were instead based on well-documented Hellenistic and Egyptian practices that were both highly practical and relatively common among the elite of her time. Her beauty regimen was a sophisticated blend of science, symbolism, and available luxury, not a collection of supernatural recipes. Let's start with the most iconic element of her look: the dramatic, kohl-rimmed eyes that have become synonymous with her image. This was not merely a fashion statement, it was a multifunctional tool rooted in thousands of years of Egyptian tradition. The kohl she used was a finely powdered mixture of galena, a lead-based ore, crushed malachite, and other minerals, mixed with animal fats or plant oils to create a paste. Applied with a small stick, it served several critical purposes. Most practically, the dark pigment around the eyes helped to reduce the sun's blinding glare reflecting off the sand and water, acting as a very effective form of ancient sunglasses. It also offered some protection from the flies and dust that were a constant fact of life in the Nile Valley. Beyond the practical, there was a profound spiritual and medicinal dimension. Egyptians believed that kohl had protective properties, warding off the evil eye and certain eye infections. They weren't entirely wrong. Recent studies have suggested that the lead salts in kohl may have triggered the production of nitric oxide in the skin, which can help boost the immune system to fight off bacteria. So her striking eye makeup was a perfect fusion of function, faith, and fashion. For her skin and complexion, Cleopatra's routine was a testament to the natural bounty of her kingdom. The famous milk and honey bath, immortalized by legend, was indeed a real practice among the wealthy, but it wasn't just about indulgence. The lactic acid in sour milk or donkey milk acts as a gentle exfoliant, softening and smoothing the skin, while the natural enzymes and antioxidants in honey provide moisturizing and antibacterial benefits. She would have been anointed with lavish quantities of perfumed oils and unguents after bathing. These were not simple scents, they were complex concoctions of olive or almond oil infused with myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and lily, precious resins and spices imported from across the known world. These oils protected the skin from the harsh, dry desert climate, locking in moisture and creating a perfumed barrier that also signaled her immense status. The sheer expense of these ingredients made them exclusive to the elite, but their use was a standard practice, not a secret invention. Her signature look would have been completed with color on her lips and cheeks, achieved not with modern lipstick but with natural stain. Red ochre, a clay rich in iron oxide, was ground into a fine powder and mixed with water or fat to create a rich red pigment. This was applied to the lips and cheeks to create a flush of color, a practice common across many ancient Mediterranean cultures. For her hands and feet, she might have used henna to create intricate patterns, another tradition with deep roots in the region for celebration and beauty. Even her hair care was advanced for its time. While she famously wore the elaborate wigs of a pharaoh for state occasions for her natural hair, she had access to treatments like castor oil to promote shine and growth, and perhaps even early forms of hair dye made from plants like henna for red highlights or walnut shells for darker tones. The crucial takeaway is that there was no single, mysterious secret to her beauty. Her power was in the meticulous, consistent application of the best available knowledge and ingredients, combined with the undeniable aura of confidence and authority she projected. She had teams of handmaidens, perfumers, and cosmeticians at her disposal to prepare these elaborate treatments daily. Her beauty routine was an integral part of her royal duties, a way to present herself as the flawless, divine incarnation of the goddess Isis to her people. It was a performance of power perfected through the application of the ancient world's most advanced, yet entirely understandable cosmetic science. And this brings us to a 29th layer of slander, one that reveals just how deeply the Roman fear of her went. It wasn't enough to paint Cleopatra as merely a seductress. Her enemies had to explain her seemingly supernatural hold over the formidable Roman general Mark Antony. The solution was to recast her not just as a queen, but as a sinister sorceress, a witch who used dark Eastern magic and powerful potions to enslave his mind and will. This narrative was a desperate attempt to make sense of a political reality that was utterly humiliating for the Roman worldview. For the victorious Octavian and his supporters, Antony's unwavering loyalty to Cleopatra was an inexplicable catastrophe. Here was one of Rome's greatest generals, a man who had proven his toughness and strategic brilliance on countless battlefields, seemingly throwing away his career, his reputation, and his very Roman identity for a foreign queen. The Roman concept of masculinity, virtus, was built on ideals of rationality, self-control, and unwavering loyalty to the state. Antony's behavior, allying himself so completely with Egypt, adopting Eastern customs, and seemingly prioritizing Cleopatra's ambitions over Rome's, was a direct affront to all of that. It made him look weak, irrational, and fundamentally un-Roman. The only logical explanation that could salvage any shred of his former glory, and more importantly, justify Octavian's war against him, was that he was not in his right mind. He hadn't made a conscious choice, he had been bewitched. This is where the propaganda machine shifted into high gear, weaponizing Roman prejudices against the mysterious and decadent East. Egypt to the Romans was a land of ancient, esoteric knowledge, strange animal-headed gods, and practices that seemed bizarre and occult from their perspective. Poets like Horace and Virgil, acting as Octavian's mouthpieces, painted vivid pictures of Cleopatra as a fatale monstrum, a fatal monster. They described her brewing sinister potions, chanting magical incantations, and practicing the dark arts to cloud Antony's judgment. This wasn't just petty gossip, it was a calculated political strategy. By framing her as a witch, they could achieve several goals at once. they could absolve Antony of some responsibility, making him a pitiable victim rather than a willing traitor. This allowed them to mourn the great Roman hero he once was while vilifying the foreign enchantress who had destroyed him. More crucially, it allowed Octavian to frame the war not as a brutal civil conflict between two Romans, but as a noble crusade to free a compatriot from demonic possession and protect Rome from dark external forces. The reality, of course, was far more rational and far more threatening to the Roman ego. Antony wasn't ensnared by magic, he was convinced by strategy. He wasn't drugged with potions, he was persuaded by partnership. Cleopatra offered him something no one in Rome could, the vast, seemingly limitless wealth of the Egyptian treasury to fund his massive military campaigns against Parthia. She provided him with a powerful, loyal naval fleet and a stable, grain-rich base of operations in the east. She was his intellectual equal, a multilingual sovereign who could discuss grand strategy, philosophy, and governance as a peer. Their relationship was a military and political merger of breathtaking scale, a conscious alliance between two powerful leaders who saw a shared future that could benefit them both. To admit this would have been to admit that a woman had outmaneuvered Rome on its own terms, using intelligence and resources rather than feminine wiles. That was a truth the Roman patriarchy simply could not stomach. It was far easier and far more satisfying to believe in the magic. The myth of Cleopatra the sorceress is perhaps the greatest compliment her enemies could have paid her. It was an admission that her real power was so formidable, so incomprehensibly effective, that it could only be explained as supernatural. To truly grasp the scale of Cleopatra's power, you must first erase the image of a queen isolated in a dusty palace surrounded by desert. Her capital, Alexandria, was not just her home, it was the gleaming, pulsing heart of her kingdom, and one of the most astonishing urban centers the world had ever seen. This was not a remote outpost of empire, it was a global supercity, the second largest in the ancient world after Rome, and in many ways its intellectual and economic superior. Ruling Alexandria was akin to governing modern-day New York, Silicon Valley, and The Hague all rolled into one, a colossal responsibility that required a mastery of economics, diplomacy, logistics, and multiculturalism. The city itself was a masterpiece of urban planning founded by Alexander the Great and perfected by her Ptolemaic ancestors. Its most famous landmark, the towering lighthouse of Pharaohs, was one of the 7 wonders of the world, a staggering feat of engineering whose massive mirror could reflect firelight for dozens of miles out to sea, guiding the endless stream of trade vessels that were the city's lifeblood. The Great Harbor was a forest of masts, with ships arriving daily from across the Mediterranean, India, and East Africa, carrying spices, silk, ivory, gold, and amber. This made Alexandria the undisputed commercial crossroads of the world, and Cleopatra controlled the customs duties, taxes, and regulations on all of it. She wasn't just a monarch, she was the CEO of the ancient world's most vital port, personally overseeing the economic policies that funneled unimaginable wealth into her treasury. But Alexandria's true power wasn't just in its commerce, it was in its mines. The city was the undisputed global capital of knowledge, home to the legendary library and the museum. This wasn't just a building with scrolls, it was the ancient equivalent of NASA, Oxford University, and the Library of Congress combined. Under its roof, the greatest geniuses of the age, astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, and poets, were paid royal salaries to think, debate, and innovate. It was here that the circumference of the Earth was first calculated with stunning accuracy, that the first steam engine was prototyped, and where groundbreaking medical dissections were performed. Cleopatra didn't just fund this institution, she was its patron and an active participant in its intellectual life. Her daily reality involved consulting with these scholars, applying their advancements in navigation for her navy, in engineering for her architecture, and in medicine for the well-being of her people. Her court was a salon of genius, and she was its center, and the population she governed was a vibrant, often volatile, melting pot. The city was meticulously divided into distinct districts: the opulent Greek quarter where the elite and the royal palace were located, the native Egyptian quarter of Rakotes, and a large, influential Jewish community with its own governing council. Each group had its own customs, laws, and tensions. Keeping peace between these factions was a delicate, constant balancing act. She had to appease the wealthy Greek aristocracy who formed her administration, respect the traditions of the native Egyptian majority whose grain fed the city, and protect the rights of the Jewish community who were vital to international trade networks. A single misstep could spark riots or rebellion. This was the complex, bustling, noisy world she navigated daily. She wasn't a recluse hiding behind palace walls. She was the ultimate administrator of a vast, multicultural metropolis, a hands-on ruler who understood that her power depended as much on smoothly managing the streets of Alexandria as it did on commanding her armies or charming Roman generals. The city was her boardroom, her treasury, her university, and her responsibility. A living, breathing entity that she ruled with a blend of intellectual curiosity and pragmatic ruthlessness. The popular image of Cleopatra effortlessly seizing power as Egypt's sole monarch is another dramatic oversimplification. The truth of her ascension is far more complex and rooted in the notoriously cutthroat traditions of her own family. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 BC, he did not name Cleopatra as the sole heir. His will, a document crafted under the watchful eyes of Roman officials, explicitly stated that she was to rule Egypt jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. This was not a unique or unusual arrangement. It was standard Ptolemaic procedure, a practice designed to provide stability, maintain the royal bloodline through a symbolic marriage, and present a unified front to the world with both a male and female figurehead. The idea that she stole the throne implies she took something that did not rightfully belong to her, but the will made her a co-ruler by law. The conflict that erupted was not between a rightful king and a usurping queen. It was a brutal power struggle between the two legally appointed co-rulers. From the very beginning, Cleopatra made her intentions clear. She was the elder sibling. She had already been her father's active co-regent for years, and she had no intention of being a silent partner to a child who was controlled by a cabal of powerful advisors. Ancient papyri from the first years of their reign tell a revealing story. Cleopatra's name consistently appeared before her brothers in official documents, and she issued decrees under her own authority, effectively sidelining the young king. She was asserting her natural position as the senior partner in the ruling duo, a move that was entirely within her rights, but one that the boys' regents, men like the eunuch Parthenos and the general Achilles, found utterly intolerable. These powerful court officials had vested interests in maintaining control, and they believed they could far more easily manipulate a 10-year-old boy than a strong-willed, politically savvy young woman in her early 20s. They strategically turned Ptolemy XIII against his sister, poisoning his mind and orchestrating a palace coup that forced her to flee Alexandria for her own safety around 48 BC. This was the true start of the civil war. It was not Cleopatra who instigated the violence to steal power. It was her brother's faction who launched the first strike to remove her from it, reducing her from an equal co-regent to an exiled rival. Her subsequent actions, raising an army in Syria and eventually forging her legendary alliance with Julius Caesar, were not the acts of a thief, but of a deposed sovereign using every means at her disposal to reclaim the authority that was legally hers and had been violently taken from her. This power dynamic was a recurring theme in the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family notorious for settling disputes of succession not through peaceful discussion but on the battlefield. Sibling rivalry often escalated to outright warfare. This was the brutal political environment she was born into and trained to navigate. Her own father, Ptolemy XII, had to buy his way back onto the throne with Roman help after being driven out by his own people. To frame Cleopatra's fight as a singular act of theft is to ignore 300 years of family history where the strongest sibling, regardless of gender, typically emerged victorious. She wasn't breaking the rules, she was playing the game exactly as it had always been played, fighting not to steal the throne, but to ensure she was the dominant ruler in the partnership she was always meant to be a part of, defending her birthright against those who sought to make her a puppet in their own schemes. This romanticized version of her story, the idea that it was ultimately a grand, doomed love affair, is perhaps the most pervasive and damaging misconception of all. To frame Cleopatra's life as a tragedy of romance is to fundamentally misunderstand everything about her. It reduces a decades-long, complex geopolitical struggle for survival into a Shakespearean subplot, prioritizing personal passion over political genius. Her narrative is not one of love lost, it is a stark tragedy about power, ambition, and the inexorable, brutal rise of the Roman Empire, with Egypt as its final, magnificent prize. The relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not the core of her story. They were the most powerful tools in her arsenal. She did not seek them out for companionship or affection, though those may have developed naturally. She pursued these alliances with the cold, calculating precision of a grandmaster moving chess pieces on a global board. In Caesar, she saw the only force capable of reinstalling her on a throne stolen by her brother's faction. He was the ultimate military guarantor of her legitimacy. With Antony, the calculus was even grander. He represented the opportunity to not just preserve Egypt, but to actively restore the Ptolemaic Empire to its former glory, creating a powerful Hellenistic Roman Eastern Bloc that could stand as a genuine equal to Rome under Octavian's control. These were not affairs of the heart. They were mergers and acquisitions of the highest order, strategic partnerships where she contributed the vast wealth and resources of Egypt in exchange for military protection and political clout. Calling it a love story also conveniently lets Rome off the hook. It sanitizes a brutal conquest into a sentimental drama. The real tragedy was not that a loving couple was torn apart, but that a brilliant sovereign's decades-long struggle to maintain her nation's independence was finally crushed by a superior military and propaganda machine. The rise of the Roman Empire required the submission of all independent powers, and Cleopatra's Egypt was the last and richest holdout. Her defeat was inevitable not because her love was too pure for this world, but because the geopolitical forces arrayed against her were simply too powerful. Octavian didn't defeat a heartbroken lover. He conquered a rival monarch and plundered her kingdom, then rewrote the history to make it seem like a romantic melodrama to hide the ugly truth of his aggression. This romantic framing is ultimately a deeply sexist reduction. It's a narrative that has been applied to powerful women throughout history, a way to contain their ambition within a familiar, non-threatening box. A man who forms strategic alliances is a savvy statesman. A woman who does the exact same thing must be motivated by emotion, by a need for a great man's love. It dismisses her immense political acumen, her economic management, and her diplomatic skill, reducing her life's work to a quest for a partner. The real Cleopatra was a head of state until her final breath, making calculated decisions to secure her son's future and her dynasty's legacy. Her choice to die by her own hand was the ultimate political statement, a final act of agency to deny Octavian the humiliation of parading her in chains through Rome. It was the defiant exit of a sovereign, not the despairing sigh of a jilted lover. To remember her for a romance is to forget her for what she truly was, the last great pharaoh of Egypt who fought until the very end to prevent her civilization from becoming just another province in Rome's ever-expanding empire. While the image of Cleopatra perpetually draped in the heavy, ceremonial gold of a pharaoh makes for stunning cinema, the 33rd misconception we need to address is the belief that this was her daily, working wardrobe. The reality is that her attire, much like her identity, was context-dependent. For the day-to-day rigors of governance, meeting with ministers, reviewing economic reports, consulting with scholars from the library, or overseeing naval logistics, she would have almost certainly dressed in the elegant, practical style of a Hellenistic monarch. Imagine her not on a golden throne, but in a sunlit chamber of the palace, dressed in a finely woven Greek chiton or a peplos of expensive, dyed linen, perhaps deep saffron or Tyrian purple. Her jewelry would have been exquisite but understated. Delicate gold earrings, a few intricate bracelets and signet rings used to seal official documents. This wasn't a lack of wealth, it was a practical necessity. The immense ceremonial pieces, the broad, beaded collars called wesek, the heavy vulture headdresses, the golden armbands and pectorals depicting gods were breathtakingly heavy and restrictive. They were the ancient equivalent of a crown and full coronation regalia, reserved for specific high-stakes moments where their symbolic power was required. These monumental pieces were tools of statecraft, not everyday accessories. She would have worn them for her coronation, for addressing the masses from a balcony, for presiding over vital religious ceremonies where she needed to embody the goddess Isis, or for sitting for the official portraits that would be minted on coins and carved into temple walls across her kingdom. In these contexts, the weight of the gold was the point. It was a physical manifestation of Egypt's unimaginable wealth and her own divine, untouchable status. The iconic image of her from the Berlin bust, for example, with its diadem and elaborate hairstyle, likely represents this official, ceremonial look. But behind closed doors, when the business of running the most powerful kingdom in the Mediterranean was underway, functionality trumped spectacle. She needed to be able to move, to write, to think clearly without being physically weighed down by 20 pounds of solid gold. This nuanced understanding of her wardrobe reveals a woman who was a master of political theater, knowing precisely when to deploy overwhelming opulence to awe her subjects and when to adopt a more pragmatic, approachable style to effectively manage the endless demands of her administration. Her power wasn't diminished by a simpler dress, it was amplified by her intelligent understanding of the right tool for the right moment. Yet, even as we acknowledge her death as a monumental historical turning point, we arrive at the 34th and perhaps most profound misconception of all: the belief that Cleopatra's suicide was the final, abrupt end of ancient Egyptian civilization itself, that the light of 3,000 years of pharaonic culture was snuffed out in a single moment. This is a powerful and poetic notion, but it oversimplifies a far more complex and gradual transition. Her death was not the extinguishing of a culture, it was the end of Egypt's political sovereignty. The vibrant, living heart of ancient Egyptian religion, culture, and daily life did not suddenly stop beating in 30 BC. Instead, it persisted, evolved, and slowly faded over the next several centuries under Roman and later Byzantine rule, creating a long, slow sunset rather than a sudden midnight. Walk through the streets of Thebes or Memphis in the decades following Cleopatra's death, and you would have been hard-pressed to see any immediate, dramatic change. The great temples at Dendera, Edfu, and Philae remained open and thrumming with activity. Priests still performed the ancient rituals, making offerings to Osiris, Isis, and Horus just as their ancestors had for millennia. The intricate hieroglyphic script continued to be carved onto temple walls, recording the deeds of the new Roman pharaohs who now stood in for the gods. In fact, some of the most magnificent and well-preserved temples we see today, like the breathtaking complex at Dendera, were completed or significantly expanded during the Roman period. The new overlords understood that to keep the peace and ensure the continuous flow of Egyptian grain to Rome, they had to pay respect to the local gods. Roman emperors from Augustus to Trajan are depicted on temple walls in full pharaonic regalia, wearing the double crown, smiting enemies, and making offerings to Egyptian deities. They were playing the part of pharaoh, a role essential for maintaining the cosmic order or Ma'at that the population believed kept their world functioning. A cultural assimilation worked both ways. The worship of Isis, the very goddess Cleopatra so powerfully embodied, did not die with her. It exploded in popularity, becoming one of the most widespread mystery religions across the entire Roman Empire. Isis temples sprang up in Rome itself, in Pompeii, and as far away as London, attracting thousands of devotees drawn to her message of salvation and eternal life. For centuries, Egyptian cults, art, and symbolism were not relics. They were a vibrant part of the Mediterranean spiritual landscape. The real end came not from a political conquest, but from a slow, religious one. The rise of Christianity, particularly after Emperor Constantine's conversion in the 4th century AD, began a systematic campaign to suppress pagan worship. Even then, the old ways proved incredibly resilient. The Temple of Isis at Philae, on Egypt's southern border, is documented as still functioning and receiving imperial subsidies well into the 6th century AD, a staggering 550 years after Cleopatra's death. It was ultimately closed by decree of the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian around 535 AD, a date many historians now point to as the true, quiet end of active ancient Egyptian religion. So, while Cleopatra's passing was the definitive close of the chapter on an independent Egypt ruled by pharaohs, the story of its people, their beliefs, and their unique identity continued to be written for generations. Her death was the fall of the crown, but the soul of the nation she ruled endured, slowly blending into a new world order until its final echoes faded into the sands of time. And this brings us to the 35th and perhaps most frustrating misconception of all, the confident belief that we know exactly what Cleopatra looked like, that we have a clear, contemporary portrait to match the legendary name. The hard, disappointing truth is that we have no undisputed, definitive image of her face. The woman who was arguably the most depicted person of her time, whose likeness would have been carved, painted, and minted across the Mediterranean, has been almost entirely lost to the ravages of time, political vengeance, and the simple fact that most ancient art was perishable. The few surviving candidates are hotly debated by scholars, leaving us to piece together a phantom from a handful of ambiguous and often contradictory clues. Consider the most famous contender, the so-called Berlin Cleopatra. This beautiful Hellenistic bust shows a woman with a graceful neck, soft, idealized features, and the classic Melonen friseur, the melon hairstyle often associated with Ptolemaic queens. She gazes serenely into the distance, a diadem tying back her curls. It's a compelling image, one that fits our romantic ideal. But is it her? Many experts point out that it lacks any definitive inscription. It could just as easily be one of her ancestors or another royal woman from the era. The style is idealizing, designed to project regal beauty rather than capture a specific, realistic likeness. It tells us how the Ptolemies wished to be seen, not necessarily how they truly appeared. For a much more likely and far less flattering candidate, we must turn to the coins. These were not works of art, they were tools of propaganda and economic exchange, and they often featured more realistic, if unsparing, portraits. The coins minted in the East by Mark Antony present a consistent image: a woman with a prominent, hooked nose, a strong, pointed chin, deep-set eyes, and a severe, thin-lipped expression. It is the face of a sovereign, not a seductress, a ruler of sharp intellect and formidable will. But here, too, we run into interpretation. Was this a realistic depiction, or was it a piece of counter-propaganda? Octavian's faction delighted in portraying Antony as emasculated and Cleopatra as a masculine, monstrous threat to Roman virtue. Exaggerating her more severe features would have served that narrative perfectly. On the other hand, the coins issued under her own authority in Alexandria show a similar profile, though often slightly softened, suggesting this strong, aquiline profile was indeed her recognized likeness. The most tantalizing possibilities come from Egypt itself. A carved temple relief at Dendera shows Cleopatra presenting her son Caesarion to the gods. She is in full pharaonic regalia, wearing the heavy crown of Hathor. But like all Egyptian art, it is highly stylized and symbolic, following a strict artistic canon designed to represent the idea of a pharaoh, not their individual physical reality. It tells us how she wanted to be seen by her Egyptian subjects as a divine, eternal ruler, but it cannot tell us the shape of her nose or the curve of her smile. The heartbreaking fact is that the most reliable portraits, the paintings that would have hung in the library of Alexandria or the royal palace, were on wooden panels or plaster walls. These organic materials simply did not survive the moisture, fires, and deliberate destruction that followed the Roman conquest. So where does this leave us? With a historical ghost, we are forced to become detectives, assembling a composite sketch from fragments. The strong features on the coins, the idealized beauty of the Hellenistic sculptures, the divine symbolism of the temple reliefs. The real Cleopatra's appearance lies somewhere in the intersection of these sources, a woman who understood the power of her image so well that she curated different versions of it for different audiences. Her true face, the one that charmed Caesar and negotiated with Antony, remains one of history's most alluring and enduring mysteries, forever hidden just behind a veil of time, forcing us to finally let go of the Hollywood close-up and instead appreciate the power of the woman who existed behind whatever face she chose to show the world. So as we pull back the curtain on these 35 misconceptions, the portrait that emerges is not of a one-dimensional seductress, but of one of the most formidable political minds of the ancient world. The real Cleopatra was a master strategist, a multilingual scholar, and a resilient leader who navigated a minefield of political threats for over 2 decades. We've shattered the myth of her Egyptian ethnicity, revealing her Macedonian Greek heritage. We've dismantled the legend of her unparalleled beauty, discovering that her true power lay in her intellect and charisma. And we've completely overturned the slander of her as a simple-minded temptress, uncovering instead a philosopher queen educated by the greatest library on earth, a shrewd economist who managed famine and funded wars, and a naval commander who led her own fleet into battle. History, as they say, is written by the victors. For 2,000 years, we have been force-fed a version of Cleopatra's story meticulously crafted by the Roman propaganda machine. A narrative designed to diminish her accomplishments, reduce her to a sexual object, and justify her conquest. It's a tale that has been embellished by poets, dramatized by Shakespeare, and glamorized by Hollywood, but it has never been the truth that ends now. It's time we look past the smears and see the real woman in her full, breathtaking complexity. A brilliant sovereign, a fluent speaker of 9 languages, a naval commander, and the last pharaoh to rule an independent Egypt. Her story is not a tragedy of romance. It is a testament to the enduring power of intellect, resilience, and political genius. So what other historical figures do you think we have all wrong? Who else has been misrepresented by the biases of their conquerors or the lens of popular culture? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more myth-busting history.